The day's light was a pale smear along the horizon, when Jon Snow lifted his gaze from the frost-hardened ground. The gray sky above the wall was heavy with clouds, and the wind that swept the ramparts carried a faint promise of snow. Down in the courtyard, men of the Night's Watch hurried to finish their assigned tasks before dusk. The clang of steel and the low murmur of voices echoing off the stone. Winter had taken hold of the north, and Jon felt it in his very bones. A tightening chill that refused to leave, even beside the warmth of torches and braziers. He stood on a narrow walkway above Castle Black, black cloak rippling behind him, and wondered how long this uneasy peace would last. He ran a hand through Ghost's thick fur. The albino direwolf sat patiently by his side, eyes pinkish red in the dim light. Jon found it comforting to keep Ghost close, a tether to the life he had once known at Winterfell, and a reminder of the loyalty that had shaped him. During these quiet moments, his thoughts turned inward. The memories of the Great War lingered. The acrid stench of dragonfire, the shrieks of the dead, and the frantic pounding of his heart as he faced unimaginable terrors. That was behind him now, or so he told himself. And yet, the chill in the air felt like more than just winter weather. It was a sense of waiting, as though the north held its breath. After a while, Jon descended from the walkway, crossing the courtyard with measured steps. Brothers hurried to complete chores, hefting buckets of water, stacking firewood, and hauling provisions. He offered them subdued nods in greeting. Their eyes flicked to him, respectfully, but remained guarded. Despite all he had done, and all he had experienced, there was always a silent caution among the Night's Watch when they looked at him. He was their Lord Commander once, then king in the north for a time, and now he had returned to serve at the Wall again, though it served more as an exile of the past than a post for any real duty. Some nights he lay awake on his straw pallet, wondering if this was truly the best place for him, wondering if there was anything left to guard against. The others were gone, the threat vanquished, and the realm was as peaceful as it had been in a century. Still, there was a disquiet in him that he could not name. Perhaps that disquiet was in the very stones of Castle Black, the ancient fortress that had stood sentinel for thousands of years. Or perhaps it was simply in his blood, that Targaryen blood he had once denied. He tried not to dwell on it. But on nights when the wind howled, he would hear it as a distant roar, like the echo of a dragon's cry. He pulled his cloak tighter and made his way to the old library. All that remained of the Watch's recorded knowledge was kept within cramped shelves of ancient tomes and scrolls. Sam had once told him of wonders hidden in these texts, fragmented histories, maps of the lands of always winter, and curious stories of hidden magic. Sam was gone now, living with Gillian, their child, pursuing Maester's studies at the Citadel. In his absence, only a handful of black brothers bothered with the dusty archives. Jon found small comfort in rummaging through these volumes by candlelight. Reading old accounts and half-forgotten tales gave him a sense of place in the endless chain of history. He stepped inside the library, Ghost trailing at his heels, and felt the comforting hush that always met him within these walls. The gray gloom outside was replaced by a glow of flickering candles set on narrow tables. He approached a leaning bookshelf and ran his fingertip along the spines of books bound in cracked leather. Some pages were as brittle as dried leaves. The hours passed quietly as he read scraps of old stories about the Age of Heroes, the forging of the Night's Watch, the many battles in the north. He found mention of the first Targaryens coming to the Wall, though the details were murky. One line, however, snagged his attention. A report of an ancient gift from the Crown to the Watch, said to have been a single dragon egg. He read it twice, convinced he must have misunderstood. The text mentioned that this egg had been entrusted to the Watch at some point before the Dance of the Dragons. There were contradictory accounts of what happened to it afterward. Some said it had been taken back to King's Landing, others that it was lost on a ranging into the far north, or that it had been buried beneath a collapsed tower at the Nightfort. The words were maddeningly vague, yet the thought lingered in Jon's mind. A second dragon egg, hidden for centuries in the north. That seemed unlikely. And yet he remembered the hush in Daenerys' voice when she had spoken of her own eggs, each said to be turned to stone yet brimming with the living heat of possibility. One had hatched for her, And everything changed. The flickering candlelight made the letters dance on the page. John felt a small thrum in his chest, an inexplicable excitement. Perhaps it was nothing more than a forgotten story. A fable. Another half-truth lost to time. But the idea seated itself in his mind. Impossible to ignore. He stayed there until his candle sputtered out, reading and rereading every mention he could find, though none were very definitive. At last, with stiff muscles and eyes burning from the strain, he closed the tome. The library was still and dim. It was deep night outside, and the hush of Castle Black cloaked him like a second skin. He needed air, needed to think. Outside, Ghost pressed close. His ears pricked, sensing the shift in Joan's mood. The wind was colder now, scattering snow across the courtyard. John looked up at the wall and found it looming like a vast white mountain in the darkness. He imagined the years of history hidden behind those ice blocks. Secrets carved and buried, drifting out of memory. If there truly was another dragon egg somewhere near, it would be older than any living person could fathom. The rational part of Joan's mind told him it was madness to even consider searching for it. But he had felt the weight of dragon eggs before, their texture like polished stone, their slumbering heat. Something in him, in that Targaryen part he still struggled to accept, stirred at the thought. In the following days, he kept an eye out for clues in the scattered library texts, questioning the most senior brothers who might have come across rumors or stories. Few knew anything. Some mentioned hearing that years ago, an old ranger claimed to have seen strange shapes in the ice caves beyond the wall. Others talked about the Nightfort's catacombs, or the tunnels that wound beneath the old castles along the wall, lost to collapse in winter snows. Unreliable stories, all of them, but each added a thread to his growing suspicion. If such an egg existed, it had been hidden for so long that it might never be found by accident. It would take purposeful searching in places men rarely ventured. For a time, John told himself it was foolishness. He reminded himself of his vow, of his duty. The days were short, and the nights were long, and the men needed leadership. Even if that leadership was far less demanding, now that the greatest threats were gone. But at odd times, his thoughts wandered to the labyrinthine space beneath the wall, to broken towers and abandoned strongholds. If he could find an old route or hidden chamber in the Nightfort, he recalled the abominable tales about it, the nightmares that had once lived there. Still, it might be worth investigating. He began making small preparations in secret, gathering a rope, a lantern, flint, and spare candles. He selected a day when the weather was passably clear, the sky only lightly dusted with clouds. Slipping away from Castle Black was not difficult. The men who remained had grown lax in their watchfulness. He saddled a horse, bundling it against the cold, and took Ghost with him. They rode west along the wall, crossing the old paths to reach the Nightfort. John was not entirely sure what he was looking for, or if he even believed he would find it. But the hum of curiosity in his veins propelled him forward. The ride was long, and the cold pressed in. Wind rattled the black trees and stirred pockets of fresh snow across the track. Ghost loped ahead, his pale fur like a wraith among the drifts, occasionally circling back to brush against the horse's flanks. John kept his eyes on the horizon, watchful for any sign of wild animals or hidden dangers. But he encountered only the wide and silent north, as if even the land itself were slumbering beneath winter's blanket. Sometime before midday, the looming silhouette of the Nightfort appeared, grim and forbidding. Its towers were shattered husks, walls half buried under ages of ice and ruin. The castle had been abandoned centuries ago, replaced by newer strongholds along the wall. Yet it retained an aura of dread that clung to the stones. John dismounted, tying the reins around a protruding timber. Ghost sniffed warily at the air. The place felt haunted, as if footsteps might echo in the corridors at any moment. Memories rose unbidden in John's mind. Stories old Nan had told him as a boy, of the Night's King and strange horrors that lurked in the dark. He forced himself to breathe steadily. The day was still young, and the pale light filtering through the clouds cast weak shadows across the crumbling courtyard. He headed inside, boots crunching over debris, stepping through a yawning archway into the remains of what had once been the Great Hall. Much of the roof had collapsed long ago. so the space was open to the cloudy sky. Moss and creeping vines grew over broken stones. The air smelled of damp and decay. John took cautious steps, turning to examine the walls for any sign or marking. He found only decades of graffiti, battered coats of arms, and deep scratches where stone had been scavenged for other uses. Wind whispered through the gaps. Ghost stayed close, silent, and watchful. They pressed on to the back of the hall, where a set of stairs descended into darkness. John lit a lantern with flint and steel, the glow illuminating stone steps thick with dust. They spiraled down into the old storerooms or dungeons, places seldom explored for generations. Each step he took echoed. He tried to calm the restless beat of his heart, telling himself these were only old ruins. But every fiber of his being bristled with the feeling that something lingered down here. As he reached the bottom, the air grew colder, and the walls wept moisture. John squeezed between fallen beams and stepped into a large chamber with a low ceiling. Broken casks and rotted crates littered the floor. He combed the area systematically, searching for hidden passages or false walls. At times, he found cracks that led to narrower tunnels, branching away into the gloom. Some were half collapsed, but a few seemed passable. Ghost slid through one of these openings, sniffing the ground, then vanished around a corner. John followed, ducking low, the lantern's flame flickering on the damp stone. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper still, and though he had read of labyrinthine passages beneath the Nightfort, experiencing them was another matter entirely. The oppressive weight of stone pressed down from every angle. At last, they emerged into a sort of antechamber. Water dripped steadily from overhead. The walls were carved with old symbols, worn by centuries of damp. Most were unreadable now, but Joan's eyes lingered on the shape of a dragon, half erased. A wave of apprehension washed over him. He raised the lantern, but the blackness beyond its reach was total. On the far side of the room, a stone slab blocked a doorway. Ancient script was chiseled into it, though he could not decipher the meaning. He pressed a hand against the slab. It was cold, unyielding, but a slight gap along one edge suggested it might open if pushed from the correct angle. He set the lantern aside carefully. With a groan of effort, he pressed his shoulder to the slab. The stone did not budge at first. John squared himself, bracing his feet, and pushed again, gritting his teeth. He could feel the resistance, as though the castle's ancient bones refused him entry. But he did not stop. He was the blood of the dragon after all. The gap widened by a finger's width. Dust and fragments of stone flaked off. With one last heave, John managed to slide the slab just enough to squeeze past. Ghost slipped in after him, and John reached back for the lantern, dragging it under the stone before standing upright again. A new chamber opened before him, smaller and more intact, with a vaulted ceiling. The air was stale, laced with the odor of something old and indefinable. In the lantern's glow, he made out the shapes of shelves carved directly into the walls. Most held rotted lumps that might once have been rolled scrolls or sacks of supplies. At the far end, on a raised pedestal, he saw an object that made his breath catch in his throat. In shape, it reminded him of an elongated stone, ridged in a pattern that was unmistakable. He had seen something similar in Daenerys' possession, though hers had been more vivid in color. This one was deep gray, almost black, the surface etched with subtle traces of swirling pattern. It was a dragon egg, or at least appeared to be so. He could barely breathe. Without thinking, he set the lantern on the ground and approached the pedestal. Ghost's ears were pinned back. The wolf sensed Joan's agitation. John ran a gloved hand over the egg's surface. It was cool, slick, and heavy, with a sense of dormant power. Although the outside was cold as stone, he felt a deep pull from within. The stories in the books had been right, or at least this object was real enough. Part of him expected it to turn to dust upon touch, but it remained solid, humming with a strange presence. In that moment, he could almost hear an echo in his mind, like the faintest beat of a distant heart. He exhaled slowly, wrestling with a rush of emotions. Awe, disbelief, perhaps even fear. The fact that it lay hidden here for centuries, undiscovered, seemed miraculous. But he also felt a profound responsibility. When Daenerys hatched her 3 eggs, it had taken blood and fire, a ritual bound in fate and prophecy. Could such a thing be repeated? Did he even want to attempt it? The war was over. The living had won. But the presence of a dragon egg in the north, so close to the wall, felt like a secret that might hold unimaginable consequences. Ghost nudged the egg with his nose, and John gently shooed him back. He wrapped it in a piece of oiled cloth he had brought for warmth, forming a makeshift sling. It felt heavier than he expected. Carefully, he made his way back through the passages, resealing the stone slab behind him as best he could. With each step, it felt as though the walls themselves were watching. When he emerged from the darkness into the ruin of the Nightfort's great hall, the sky had begun to darken again. Another day nearly spent in searching, but he had found something more precious than he dared believe. He wasted no time in mounting his horse, cradling the egg carefully. Ghost bounded alongside as he urged the horse into a steady canter, leaving the Nightfort behind. The journey back to Castle Black was tense, each creak of branches making him glance over his shoulder. The egg was snug under his cloak, a hidden treasure. He wondered if he should tell anyone. Should he confide in the Lord Commander who had taken his place, or write to Sam? The possibilities churned in his mind. For now, he kept silent. Let the world remain ignorant of this new reality for a time. Night closed around them, and the wall's towering silhouette finally came into view. The fortress gates stood open, a few guards warming themselves by a brazier. John slipped through with minimal interaction, giving the men a curt nod. No one asked what he carried. At Castle Black, he stabled his horse, making sure it was well fed and brushed down, then made his way to his small private quarters in the corner of the courtyard. The room was spare: a cot, a table, a single flickering lantern. Ghost padded in, circling once before lying down with a quiet huff. John sat on the edge of his cot and carefully unveiled the egg. By lamplight, the texture of its surface seemed almost alive. The ridges formed patterns reminiscent of scales, though some lines were so faint that they might have been illusions. He passed a hand over it, half expecting to feel warmth or a pulse. Of course, it remained cool. Still, a current of energy thrummed in his fingertips. He forced himself to think logically. Dragons came from heat, from flame. The birth of Daenerys dragons had required an intense fire, the likes of which had not been seen in a century. Even so, the realm was not in a state of war. There were no pyres for Khal Drogo, no sorcery-laden axe to fuse blood and flame. John shook his head, reminded of how insane it seemed to even contemplate hatching another dragon. But ignoring the egg was impossible. A new dragon in the north might be an omen of better days, or a harbinger of war. He could not be sure. He decided to keep it secret for the time being. If anyone discovered the egg, there would be no end of complications. The king in the south might see it as a threat. Others might desire to claim it for themselves. It might spark political upheaval anew. Having fought for peace, John felt no eagerness to provoke more conflict. Yet returning the egg to the Targaryen queen, if she still had any claim, was also a thought. He didn't even know if Daenerys lived or not in this moment. Rumors about her fate were as plentiful as the stars. One whisper said she had flown east, another that she had died. John had no certain knowledge, and the egg was in his hands now. His breath fogged in the cold chamber. He carefully wrapped the egg again and placed it in a wooden chest beneath his cot, layering furs around it for protection. He blew out the lantern, letting darkness swallow the room, and lay back. Exhaustion claimed him quickly, but his dreams were restless. He saw fleeting images of a dragon spiraling above the wall, ice splintering below as it beat its mighty wings. He saw the old godswood of Winterfell covered in drifts of snow, a dragon perched amid ancient weirwood branches. In the dream, a soft, mournful roar called to him, stirring something deep in his soul. When morning came, he woke to a dull ache in his muscles, but an intensity in his gaze that startled him. The egg was still safely hidden. He stepped out into Castle Black's courtyard, greeted by the sight of a gentle snowfall swirling in the gray light. The men of the watch were performing their daily tasks, sparring, feeding the ravens, cleaning gear. Jon's presence no longer commanded the same hush it once did. But the men still knew him, still respected him in a quiet way. He found that none of them appeared to suspect anything out of the ordinary. He took breakfast in the mess hall as usual, exchanging polite words with a few brothers who inquired about his health. After that, he spent the day training some new recruits on the practice yard, going through basic sword drills. It felt strangely normal, as if the egg were not hidden just steps away in his quarters. But the knowledge ate at him. Whenever a lull in duties came, his mind drifted to that secret. He had never been good at deception. The knowledge felt like a living thing inside him, at times heavy as lead, at times fluttering with anticipation. Late in the evening, he returned to his room, lit a candle, and carefully withdrew the egg. He held it in his lap, studying every curve and ridge. It was beautiful in a fierce, forbidding way. What would the future hold if it hatched? A single dragon, bonded to him as its rider. Or perhaps it would remain inert, a curiosity. Either outcome made him uneasy, but a spark within him yearned to see it alive. He had flown on the back of Rhaegal once, felt the world vanish beneath the rush of wings. That memory still left him breathless. And the dragon had accepted him, recognized something in his blood. What would this unhatched creature sense? As days passed, he began to slip into a pattern, performing his duties by day, and by night, studying the egg. He read through old texts again, searching for any mention of how Targaryens awakened petrified dragon eggs. Most references credited magic, sacrifice, or a raw bond with fire. One account spoke of a secret method used by the Valyrians, a combination of alchemical processes, intense heat, and arcane words. But it was all rumor. He was no sorcerer, and he had neither the resources nor the knowledge of old Valyria. So for now, the egg remained a puzzle. But the more he held it, the more he began to feel subtle changes. Or perhaps it was only his imagination. Sometimes he thought it held a faint warmth. Other times he swore the surface was slightly rougher, as though small cracks might be forming under the ridges. He didn't dare share this with anyone, not even close allies in the Watch. Secrets this large had a way of slipping out. If the world learned of another dragon egg, the realm would descend upon the north, curious or afraid or hungry for power. On the coldest nights, Jon found himself recalling the old prayers he had once whispered as a boy in the Godswood. Now, words half-remembered sprang to his lips in the quiet as he sat with the egg by a tiny brazier, as if praying for guidance or some sign from the old gods. The flames flickered in the brazier, casting dancing shadows on the egg's rough pattern. If it was to hatch, it would need warmth, true consuming heat. But even so, he feared the dangers that might arise if he attempted to bathe it in fire. The last time such a thing was done, men had died, a witch had invoked blood magic, and Daenerys had walked into the flames of her husband's funeral pyre. Jon was not so bold, nor did he have a Cal's pyre to feed it. As the weeks went by, the weather turned harsher. Blizzards raged along the wall. Patrols were forced to shelter, and men grew restless within Castle Black's confines. That was the North's way, though, forging men in darkness. Jon avoided extended conversation, choosing to stay silent, his mind always drifting back to the hidden egg. He felt a bit of guilt for the deception, but a deeper sense of purpose now drove him. Something about the presence of that silent, waiting dragon form seemed to stir old instincts. It reminded him that his fate was never only that of a simple bastard from Winterfell. One afternoon, he ventured beyond the wall again, this time alone, to a frozen lake where he sometimes hunted. The silence of the wild soothed him, while also sharpening his senses. He brought down a scrawny elk, and, after field dressing it, lingered in the hush. The sky was a deep slate color, and the pine forest stood stark against the snow. He recalled once traveling beyond this point, with Tormund Giantsbane and others, braving storms and white walkers. That felt like an entire lifetime ago. Now the land was quiet, and it struck him that the war had ended. But life continued in its harsh northern manner. Change was not undone, but paused, waiting for a new chapter. On a whim, he placed a gloved hand on the frozen surface of the lake, feeling the intense cold through the leather. Would that be enough to quench dragon fire, he wondered. Could a dragon survive such extremes? His mind conjured an image of a small hatchling, perhaps black as night, forging a bond with him in these very snows. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Jon realized He had no real plan. He had found the egg, but to what end? Could he truly bring another dragon into the world? A swirl of wind startled him from his thoughts, and he decided it was time to return to Castle Black. He carried the elk meat back, turning each possibility over in his head like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. That evening, as he dried his clothes by the fire and nursed a mug of thin ale, he finally acknowledged something that had been growing in him for days. He wanted to attempt to hatch the egg. He did not know how. He did not know if it would succeed. But the sense of rightness, of possibility, loomed too large to ignore. The seeds of that desire had been planted the moment he discovered he was Aegon Targaryen, the moment he understood his lineage. It had been easy to deny when his life was consumed by battles against the living and the dead. Now that the danger had passed, he realized just how deeply he yearned to understand the dragon side of his heritage. He set about collecting what meager sources of information might help him. By candlelight, he pored over scattered references to dragon lore. The old Valyrian kings were said to have used something called dragon's breath or secret forges to keep the eggs hot, ensuring they did not become dormant. But the specifics were lost to time. Another text spoke of a mother's body heat as crucial, leading some Targaryen princesses to cradle their eggs night after night. Still, another claimed that moonlight and certain incantations were necessary. All these contradictions only highlighted how little was truly known. Finally, late one night, he decided on a simple approach. He built a small hearth in a hidden corner of the old armory, which was seldom used now. The structure was of solid stone, and he could stoke the fire as hot as possible. He would place the egg near the flames, keep it warm, and see if it showed any sign of responding. It was a far cry from the spectacle of Daenerys' pyre, but it was a start. Ghost followed him quietly as he carried the egg swaddled in furs to the dark armory. The place smelled of rust and old leather. He cleared a spot near the main forge, which was rarely lit these days. The forge itself was in disrepair, but the hearth next to it still worked well enough. Under the flickering torchlight, Jon carefully stacked kindling and coal, forming a careful bed. He added some scraps of wood, then struck flint, coaxing sparks into a feeble glow that blossomed into flame. Soon, a low fire crackled, warming the stone around it. Jon unwrapped the egg, pausing to admire its dark gray surface one more time. The ridges caught the dancing light, revealing swirling patterns, reminiscent of coiled serpents. Carefully, he placed it beside the hearth, close enough to feel the heat, yet not so close as to be scorched. Then he piled more coal, building the temperature bit by bit. For hours he fed the fire, his face slick with sweat despite the chill in the rest of the armory. Ghost settled a short distance away, blinking in the glow. Outside, Castle Black was still, with most men asleep or tucked away. The wind rattled the rafters, occasionally scattering ash. Jon waited, leaning on a small stool, eyes fixed on the egg's silhouette. The only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the quiet thump of his own heartbeat. He whispered words he barely remembered, a half prayer, half plea. Something in Valyrian, though he did not speak the tongue well. Images of Daenerys stepping into the flames haunted him. He knew that might be required, a willingness to sacrifice more than he could bear. As the hours stretched, the egg grew warm to the touch. Once or twice he thought he felt it shift slightly, but perhaps that was just the heat expanding the shell. By the time dawn began to pale the sky outside, he was exhausted, half dozing on the stool. The fire had reduced to glowing embers. He reached for the egg. It was still warm. A hollow ache settled in his chest. He was not sure what he had expected. That it might crack open, and a living dragon would greet him. That seemed too simple. Nonetheless, he had taken the first step. Even if the egg remained dormant, he felt an odd satisfaction. The knowledge that he was attempting the impossible made him feel more alive than he had in weeks. Carefully, he wrapped the egg in furs again, letting it retain whatever warmth it had absorbed. He banked the fire so it would smolder for some time. Then, with Ghost at his side, he slipped back to his quarters, cradling the egg like a precious child. And so began a new routine. Each night, when most of Castle Black slept, Jon would tend a fire in the armory hearth. resting the egg by the flames for hours. He guarded it, watched it, sometimes spoke to it in a low murmur, as if coaxing a sleeping creature to awaken. By the faint glow of embers, he traced his fingertips over the shell's ridges and felt a sense of wonder. Perhaps nothing would come of it. Or perhaps the north would someday tremble to the sound of beating wings. Days turned into weeks. Snowstorms battered the wall, layering the courtyard in thick drifts. The brothers grumbled about the cold, their daily chores turning into laborious struggles against ice and wind. John continued to manage his duties quietly, leading by example, offering help where needed. But his mind was consumed at night by the egg, his hope unwavering. Some of the men noticed his late wanderings. One or two teased that he seemed troubled by ghosts. If they only knew how literal that was, with a real direwolf at his side, and the ghost of Targaryen magic, kindling in the darkness. He did not tell a soul what he was doing. The secrecy weighed on him, but the alternative was unthinkable. For the first time, he felt that the ghostly hush around the wall was not merely emptiness. It was potential. A new beginning was coalescing, something that could redefine the North, redefine Jon Snow himself. He recalled how a single dragon was said to be worth an entire army. If the egg hatched, the realm would feel its presence, one way or another. But perhaps it would remain a silent secret, known only to him and a few trusted friends, until he chose the right moment to reveal it. On the 18th night of this ritual, after carefully placing the egg near the coals, Jon thought he heard the faintest crackle that did not come from the fire. The hair on his neck stood on end. He held his breath and leaned closer. A popping sound, almost imperceptible, echoed from within the shell. He watched intently, heart pounding. Then silence. He waited, straining to hear more, but nothing came. Had he imagined it? Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked, as though he too had caught a fleeting sound. Jon's pulse drummed in his ears. He reached out tentatively, brushing his knuckles against the egg. Warm, vibrating with a faint tension, but no visible cracks. In that moment, an overwhelming surge of hope threatened to break him. He let out a slow breath, nodded to Ghost, and continued tending the fire. This was more than mere fancy. Something was stirring within. If it truly cracked, if a hatchling emerged, how would he care for it in the frigid north? The question weighed heavily. Dragons were creatures of fire and sky, not ice and gloom. Yet Rhaegal and Viserion and Drogon had flown over northern battlefields. They had breathed flame over the undead. They had survived the biting cold, if only for a short time. Jon told himself that if the hatchling truly survived, he would find a way to protect and nurture it. A plan began to form in his mind, to fly south for a time if necessary, or to build a hidden refuge heated by forges. But these were all half-formed notions. First, the egg must hatch. If it ever did. Sleep was impossible that night. He remained in the armory until the early light crept through cracks in the walls, dozing fitfully against a pile of old sacks, the egg in his arms for warmth. By morning, he saw no new cracks. Still, he would not be deterred. Each day henceforth, he examined the shell meticulously for any sign of change. He found subtle lines, possibly new fissures, or simply illusions from the interplay of firelight and shadow. For all the excitement in his heart, progress was agonizingly slow. One evening, a new steward named Bowen, seeing the light in the armory, ventured in to investigate. Jon nearly jumped at the intrusion, but he kept his composure, discreetly covering the egg with a spare cloak. He explained that he was working on a small project to repair the hearth. Bowen seemed to accept it, though he cast curious glances at the concealed shape. Jon dismissed him kindly, breathing a sigh of relief as the steward left. He would have to be more careful. The risk of discovery was growing, and if the egg really was nearing hatching, the event might be anything but subtle. Still, he couldn't abandon his attempts now. He sensed the shell was alive with a tension that reminded him of the hush before a storm. In his mind, the memory of riding Rhaegal felt more like destiny than happenstance. Could it be that this was meant to be? That House Targaryen would have a new scion of flame, hidden in the north? Or was he simply chasing illusions, hoping for a miracle where none existed? The ritual continued under cover of darkness. the hush punctuated only by crackling embers and Joan's low murmurs. He fed the fire, circled the hearth, sometimes kneeling in silent vigil. Ghost was ever present, watchful. The nights blurred into a long tapestry of red glow, swirling ash, and the uncertain promise of what lay within the egg. And, day by day, John found the heaviness in his spirit lifting, replaced by an ember of purpose that refused to die. He did not know what the morrow would bring, but he would face it head-on, guided by the primal beat he felt echoing in his own blood. Then came a night, some time past the first full moon of winter, when he heard another popping noise. Stronger this time. He jerked awake from a half-doze and held his breath. A faint line of blackish red, almost like a hairline fracture, snaked along the surface of the egg, illuminated by the hearth's orange glow. He stared, pulse thundering. Gently, he set a hand on the shell. It was hot, almost too hot to touch. Another tiny crack appeared, branching off the first. John felt a rush of exhilaration and fear all at once. Whether in a matter of minutes, hours, or days, it was happening. The shell was weakening, ready to yield to the living force inside. He murmured softly, though he knew not what words to say. Instinct guided him to feed the fire, stoking it to an intense blaze that filled the armory with heat. Sweat trickled down his neck, and Ghost paced anxiously nearby. Flames licked at the edges of the hearth, sparks dancing upward. John held the egg in his hands, cradling it just above the roaring flames, carefully turning it to ensure even warmth. The cracks spread, a lacework of hairline fractures weaving across the shell's ridges. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat echoing in his skull. A ragged gasp escaped him when the first chip of shell loosened, sliding away. Beneath it, he glimpsed a glistening darkness, pulsing with faint life. The hatchling was struggling, he realized, trying to free itself. He held his breath, terror mingling with wonder. This was the moment he had both longed for and dreaded. A living dragon was about to enter the world under the roof of Castle Black, in the far north, away from the warm lands and Targaryen traditions. John braced himself, half expecting an explosion of heat or flame. But the only fires were those he had stoked. The hatching was more subtle, an unsteady crackling, a series of small snaps as fragments of shell broke away. The creature within emitted a tiny rasping sound, like a squeak that only just qualified as a roar. John's throat tightened. He carefully peeled away a shard of shell, revealing a wet, sinewy shape. It was no larger than a newborn cat, blackish scales glinting with an underhue of dark green. The tiny wings twitched, slick with embryonic fluid. Its little head was crowned with blunt horns, and sharp ridges lined its spine. For a heartbeat, it did not move, still half trapped in the egg's remains. Then, slowly, it lifted its head and opened eyes that gleamed a deep, feral gold in the firelight. John stared, heart pounding so violently he thought it might wake the entire castle. The hatchling trembled, letting out another weak chirp. Without thinking, John moved it closer to the heat, mindful not to scald it. He recalled the legends. Baby dragons needed warmth above all else. The dampness on its scales began to steam off, and the hatchling took a shaky breath, exhaling a pitiful wisp of smoke. Watching it, John felt a surge of love and protectiveness, unlike anything he had ever known, akin to how he felt for Ghost, or his siblings, or even for Rhaegal in those fleeting moments they had shared in the sky. As the last fragments of shell fell away, the dragon tested its limbs. A spindly tail curled and uncurled. Sharp claws scraped the edge of the hearth. John moved it to a nest of warm furs, close to the embers. The hatchling blinked, turning its head clumsily. Ghost sniffed the air, tail stiff, clearly unsure what to make of this scaly newcomer. The two creatures locked gazes for a moment, the direwolf and the baby dragon, each representing opposite corners of an ancient, fantastical world. John could not speak. All he could do was watch as the dragon took its first trembling steps. It was fragile, but there was a primal intensity in its movements, a promise of power yet to come. The shape of its wings, half unfolded and glistening, caught the firelight like polished obsidian. A Targaryen birth, here in the land of ice. He wondered if the old gods bore witness, if his father's spirit looked on with alarm or awe. He felt an almost dizzying sense of destiny, and with it, a crushing responsibility. He was alone with this miracle, a second dragon, brought forth in the north. Whatever course lay ahead, he had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back from this moment. The hatchling let out another tiny hiss, opening its jaws to reveal needle-fine teeth. John reached out slowly, letting it catch his scent. For a heartbeat, he feared it might snap at him, but instead, it emitted a soft squeak and then pressed its head into his palm. A trembling breath escaped John. Gently, he stroked the newborn scales, feeling their delicate warmth. This little dragon was his to protect and nurture. The next challenges would be immense, keeping it alive in the cold, keeping it hidden from prying eyes, learning to feed it, to let it breathe fire, to grow strong wings. Still, in that fragile dawn of realization, John felt hope unspool in his chest. The north might be a frozen land, but tonight, in a hidden corner of Castle Black, the fires of House Targaryen had been reborn. He gathered the hatchling close, warming it against his chest. Outside, the wind howled past the walls, swirling snow over ancient stones. But for the moment, within the soft glow of the dying hearth, there was only the slow beat of Jean's heart, the hush of Ghost's breath, and the faint crackle of embers. The dragon's golden eyes fluttered closed, and John felt a powerful bond unfurling between them, as inexorable as the turning of the seasons. The secret was theirs now. A new story was beginning in the north, and though the path ahead was shrouded, Jon Snow was determined to walk it. He would care for this creature, whatever the cost, and perhaps in doing so, find the purpose he had lost. Gazing at the tiny dragon, he whispered, "You're not alone, I'm here." And for the first time in a long while, he believed in the promise of tomorrow. In the minutes that followed, Jon scarcely dared to breathe. He could only stare at the damp, trembling creature clutched in his hands, so fragile yet so full of feral promise. The hatchling's eyes, still hazy from the fluid that once filled the egg, fixed on him with an intensity that defied its newborn helplessness. Each blink was slow, as though the dragon were testing this new reality. Its thin bat-like wings unfurled and twitched, revealing faint webs of blood vessels against black scales that shone like polished onyx in the hearth's glow. Jon cradled the little thing closer to the fire, mindful not to scorch it but understanding that it needed heat more than anything else. Ghost kept a wary distance, hackles slightly raised, torn between curiosity and a primal caution. The direwolf sniffed the air, ears pricking at every chirp the dragon made. Jon felt a brief pang of worry. Would these two ever be able to coexist? The North had never been home to dragons, and direwolves were an ancient symbol of House Stark. But as the newborn squeaked again, Ghost took a tentative step forward, muzzle extended. Jon tensed, preparing to intervene if the wolf bared his teeth. Slowly, Ghost pressed his nose to the tiny creature's side. The dragon responded with another squeaking hiss, but it did not recoil. After a moment, Ghost backed away, seemingly satisfied that this new being was not an immediate threat. Jon allowed himself a shaky exhale. His attention returned to the dragon. Carefully, he used a corner of the cloak to wipe away some of the remaining egg residue clinging to its scales. The creature flexed its little claws, scraping the stone floor in small, trembling motions. Its belly was hollow with hunger, and a faint squeal rose from its throat, a plaintive sound that seemed to say, "Feed me." Jon racked his mind for any knowledge of newborn dragons. Daenerys had once spoken about feeding her hatchlings raw meat, of how they needed nourishment soon after birth. He considered the meager supplies around him. The old armory wasn't exactly brimming with fresh provisions, but he had a small stash of dried meats and salted cuts hidden in a corner for the nights he spent stoking the fires. That might have to do until he could secure something better. Still, would dried venison or mutton suffice for a creature of fire and scale? He glanced around the dark space, the anvil and rusted tools looming like ghosts. Quietly, he set the dragon on the warm furs by the hearth, ensuring it stayed close to the embers radiating heat. Then he rummaged in a battered leather sack, pulling out a strip of half-cured venison. Though it was tough as boiled leather, It was the closest thing to raw he had on hand. Kneeling, he offered a small piece to the hatchling. The dragon sniffed at it tentatively, gave a high-pitched hiss, and snapped its jaws. It managed to tear a sliver free, swallowing awkwardly before letting out a tiny cough. John quickly realized the piece was too big or too fibrous. He used his dagger to slice thinner strips, offering them one by one, until the hatchling learned to chew in its own way, an odd, sideways motion that eventually worked. Each swallow was accompanied by a shudder, but once the meat slid down, the dragon seemed a fraction stronger. Encouraged, John fed it several more small pieces, watching as the creature's belly filled. Its breathing steadied and the squeaks grew softer. Within a few minutes, the newborn's eyelids drooped with exhaustion. The effort of feeding and breathing in this cold realm seemed to sap all its strength. Carefully, John lifted it into his arms, pressing it against the front of his cloak near the fire. That would keep the dragon warm while it slept. He felt an odd surge of tenderness that caught him off guard. It wasn't merely a sense of awe anymore. It was protectiveness, a paternal instinct he hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Here was a life that depended solely on him, a life so rare that it changed everything about who he was and what he might become. He realized then that time had slipped away. Dawn must be near, or at least not far off. If he lingered too long, the risk of someone wandering into the armory would skyrocket. Already a handful of men sometimes questioned why he spent late hours tinkering around the old forge. Tonight's events had gone beyond merely stoking fires. If anyone discovered this fresh-hatched dragon, the entire realm might erupt in chaos. John would have to move quickly and carefully. Gently, he placed the sleeping hatchling back onto the furs. Its sides rose and fell in shallow rhythmic breaths. The once slick scales were drying, the black surface turning matte, the faint green sheen nearly lost in the dimness. He decided to use one of the crates in the corner, half filled with old scraps of cloth, to fashion a makeshift nest. The crate would be easy enough to move and hide. Pulling out the rotted bits of cloth, he replaced them with the best furs he could gather, positioning them so the dragon could nestle against layers of warmth. Then, with trembling care, he slid the hatchling inside, folding an extra fur over the top for insulation. For a moment, he simply watched it sleep. In the hush, the only sounds were the fading crackle of embers and Ghost's slow breathing. Then, taking one last look around, John doused the fire to embers and hoisted the crate in his arms. It was an awkward weight with the small but precious cargo inside, yet not impossible to manage. He considered heading directly to his own cramped quarters, but decided against it. The temperature there was frigid most nights, and a single brazier hardly kept the chill at bay. Moreover, it would be all too easy for a steward to walk in, dropping off linens or delivering some trivial message. The risk was too high. He needed a safer hiding place, somewhere in the bowels of Castle Black, far from prying eyes, preferably with existing warmth, or at least an enclosure that could trap heat. The old tunnels came to mind, the same labyrinth of corridors that burrowed under the wall, linking storerooms and forgotten chambers. Yet many of those spaces were damp and drafty. The library basement was another option. Hardly anyone ventured below its ground floor, but that might be too close to the books, and the occasional brother who rummaged for records or old maps. At last, he thought of the hidden cells, a cluster of disused dungeon chambers half blocked off by collapsed masonry. He had discovered them once by accident while investigating a storeroom leak. The corridor leading there was obscure enough that no one bothered with it, and there was a half-intact fireplace in one corner that might hold a small blaze. It wasn't ideal, but it would serve until he figured out something more permanent. Making sure the hatchling was still asleep, John slipped out of the armory, Ghost padding beside him, and stepped into the silent courtyard. Snow fell softly in the pre-dawn gloom. The wall loomed overhead, a sheer and icy monolith that reflected the faint light. The torches along the parapets were little more than glimmers, and no watchman seemed to notice as John trudged along the shadows, cradling the crate. Ghost's footfalls were soundless in the drifts of white. Despite the cold biting at his exposed cheeks, John felt a deep warmth in his chest. A quiet exhilaration. He was carrying a dragon through Castle Black. A part of him still struggled to believe it was real. He made for the narrow passage along the northern edge of the fortress. A row of makeshift storerooms stood there, used sporadically for overflow supplies. Most were locked or half collapsed, but a particular door at the end had rotted so badly that one could slip through a gap in the frame. John slipped inside, carefully maneuvering the crate past splinters of wood, then moved deeper, aiming for a descending flight of stairs. Moonlight through the broken boards provided just enough illumination for him to step safely. Down below, the air turned stagnant, carrying the faint scent of mildew. All stone corridors stretched in multiple directions, branching like an underground labyrinth. John kept his steps measured, trying not to jostle the crate too much. Ghosts sniffed at the walls, occasionally pausing to scratch at the floor. Rats, or worse, might lurk in these forgotten corners. But if luck was on Joan's side, no one else would venture here. At length, he reached the hidden cells, a cluster of dank rooms separated by rusted iron bars and old crumbling doors. The corridor was partially caved in on one end, leaving only 2 accessible chambers. He stepped into the first one, which had an ancient fireplace set in the far wall. The flue was cracked, probably letting in some outside airflow. That might be enough to vent smoke, if he dared a small fire. The room itself was relatively intact, though the floor was strewn with rubble and debris. He set down the crate near the fireplace, wincing at the echo that thumped through the silent corridor. One of the wooden boards underfoot groaned dangerously. He waited, half expecting a guard's voice to echo from above, but the castle remained quiet. Relieved, he let out the breath he'd been holding. Ghost nosed around the perimeter, sniffing at cobwebs in the corners. John crouched beside the crate, lifting the top fur. The hatchling remained asleep, its belly rising and falling in small, steady motions. He would need supplies. Wood, coals, food, even some sort of makeshift bedding. This was a start, but it wouldn't keep the dragon healthy for long. In the days to come, he would have to improve this hideout. Perhaps he could discreetly bring in a brazier or salvage a few bricks to reinforce the fireplace. He considered how best to do this without rousing suspicion. The night's watch was not particularly large anymore, but the men who served were keen observers when it came to unusual activities. A few had already commented on how little John slept and how he paced the castle at odd hours. Pressing a hand gently on the hatchling's back, he felt warmth there. The creature shifted slightly, letting out a soft squeak before settling again. Joan's throat tightened with emotion. He wondered if this was how Daenerys felt in those initial days, caring for something so miraculous yet so vulnerable. A pang of guilt struck him at that thought. There had once been a time when Daenerys and he might have shared more than just blood and destiny. He had never truly resolved that chapter of his life, and perhaps he never would. But the memory of her forging ahead with her dragons, even as the world doubted her, encouraged him now. He could almost hear her voice urging him to protect what he had brought into existence. He placed the fur back over the hatchling and rose, picking his way through the debris. He'd have to gather some firewood from the stores. At this early hour, he might have to wait until the keep was more awake, so that retrieving wood would seem normal enough. There were chores that needed doing, and a day's worth of drudgery awaited him. John realized with some wry amusement that he was still a brother of the Night's Watch, exiled or not, and the daily routine would hardly pause for the birth of a dragon. Exiting the hidden cells proved easier than entering, as he knew the route. He made a mental note of each turn, each corner, how the corridor twisted under the fortress. After a careful climb up the broken stairs, he slipped out through the battered door into the courtyard, just as the first pale light spread across the sky. The new day was officially here. He trudged to his own quarters, Ghost at his heels, heart hammering from both the cold and the weight of what he had done. Once inside, he quickly stripped off his wet boots and shrugged out of his cloak, dropping onto his cot for a few precious minutes of rest. But his mind buzzed too wildly for real sleep. The image of the little black dragon was seared into his vision. Eventually, the calls of the watchman roused him from his state of half-slumber. It was time to make an appearance in the yard, to keep up the pretense of normalcy. He splashed his face with icy water from a basin, scrubbing away the grime and exhaustion. The mirror he used, a piece of polished metal mounted on the wall, showed him an image of dark circled eyes unkempt hair, and a face older than his years. Yet there was something else there too. A spark of life that he hadn't seen in himself for a long while. Stepping into the daylight, he joined the other brothers as they prepared for morning drills and chores. A few offered greetings. Others were too busy yawning in the crisp air. John nodded absently, his thoughts drifting back to the dragon with every breath. He made small talk in the mess hall, forcing down some porridge that tasted of stale oats. Brothers griped about the wind, about the shortage of fresh supplies. John volunteered to help with the wood supply, his heart skipping a beat at the thought of discreetly gathering extra for the hidden cells. The men in charge of the wood storehouse were surprised but not unwelcoming. John had a strong back, and there was never a shortage of logs to split. By midday, he found himself in the storehouse, methodically splitting logs with a heavy axe. Each downward swing sent chips flying. The repetitive motion a strangely soothing counterpoint to his whirling mind. Occasionally, he gathered armfuls of the smaller splinters and kindling, setting them aside in a separate pile. Under the guise of cleaning up scraps, he managed to bundle a fair amount of suitable firewood that could be smuggled out later. The unrelenting ache in his shoulders and back felt like penance, a price to pay for sheltering a secret that would shake the realm if discovered. The hours dragged on. By the time dusk approached, his arms trembled with fatigue and his stomach growled. Even so, the moment he was free to slip away, he seized it. Taking care not to be followed, he gathered the hidden bundle of kindling under one arm, a small sack of coals under the other, and found his way back to that battered door. Ghost, sensing his intention, trotted silently behind him. The corridors below remained just as dark, save for the torch John carried in one hand. Shadows jumped across damp walls, and water dripped from the stone overhead. Inside the chamber, he found the hatchling awake, perched awkwardly on the edge of its fur nest. Its eyes flared at the sudden glow of the torch, and it let out a faint, scratchy hiss. John set down his supplies. The firewood clacked on the stone, and the hatchling jerked its head at the noise, wings half unfurled in a defensive stance. John moved slowly, murmuring soft words that he wasn't sure the dragon could understand, but the gentle tone seemed to calm it. After a few moments, the creature settled, though its gaze tracked his every movement. He knelt by the fireplace, clearing out ashes and old debris, until he found a shallow space where he could stack kindling and coals. Lighting them took time and care. The flue was cracked, so the draft was inconsistent. Eventually, a weak flame danced to life, soon growing into a modest fire. The chamber glowed with a flickering orange warmth that chased away the gloom. He turned back to the hatchling, relieved that it seemed healthy. If anything, its eyes were more alert than before, shining in the dimness with reptilian intelligence. Cautiously, he picked up a small piece of the salted venison he had brought. The hatchling sniffed the air, recognized the scent, and emitted a keening noise. As John offered it the meat, the dragon snapped it up without hesitation. A surge of relief washed over him. At least it was willing to feed. He repeated the process, slicing manageable bits with his dagger, feeding them one by one. Between swallows, the hatchling made soft, gurgling sounds that might have been contentment. There was no sign of fire breath yet, but in time, that might come. After feeding, he let the hatchling crawl onto his forearm, supporting its belly with his other hand. Its tiny claws pricked his skin through the fabric of his tunic, but he hardly noticed. The creature's hide felt warmer now, as if the heat from the fire had stoked the embers of something deep within. In the flickering orange light, its glossy black scales seemed patterned with faint silver traces. A marvel of nature. John studied the shape of its head, the ridges that one day would become formidable horns, the miniature fangs that already looked sharp as needles. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" he said softly, though he knew the dragon could not answer. But the hatchling tilted its head, as if trying to decipher the tone of his voice. A tiny forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Satisfied with its progress, John carefully set it back on the furs near the fire and started to inspect the chamber. He needed a better arrangement if he was going to keep the dragon here. Some place it could grow without constantly risking discovery. A fleeting thought told him that in weeks or months, the creature might be too large to hide in such a place, but he refused to think that far ahead. one step at a time. For now, securing warmth and a reliable food supply was his main concern. He checked the walls for any holes or gaps a wandering rat might use. Dragons would eventually eat rats, of course, but not while this one was so small and vulnerable. The cracks in the mortar were concerning. He'd have to patch them, maybe with cloth or with lumps of old pitch if he could find them. The half-rotted door at the corridor's end had no proper lock. He'd need to improvise something so that no curious brother wandered in by accident. Over the next few days, John settled into a covert routine. He trained with the men, supervised watch duties, and performed tasks as usual during the day. By night, he returned to the hidden cells, often under the guise of checking a leak or rummaging for forgotten supplies. He'd built a rudimentary latch on the door using scraps of metal he scavenged from the armory. While not foolproof, it dissuaded casual intrusions. Each time he descended the stairs, his heart pounded. Yet each time he found the hatchling waiting, huddled near the embers he left smoldering, bright eyes alert. It recognized him, chirping softly when he approached. The bond between them grew more tangible. When he stroked its neck, he felt it relax, a low rumble vibrating in its throat. He discovered it had a voracious appetite. The salted meats were dwindling quickly, and dried rations could only go so far. He realized he would need fresh kill. Rabbits, birds, even fish if he could manage. So, he began hunting expeditions beyond the wall, or into the forests south of Castle Black, claiming the need to replenish the watch's stores. No one questioned him too deeply. Men were glad for extra rations, after all. But John always set aside the best parts for the hatchling, slicing them into bite-sized chunks. By the time he delivered the rest to the kitchens, no one seemed to notice a missing haunch of rabbit, or a fillet of something he claimed was lost along the way. As the hatchling fed on raw meat, it grew stronger at an astonishing rate. Within a week, it no longer trembled in the cold. It moved with a bit more confidence, testing its wings, and occasionally flapping them in futile attempts to fly. Of course, it was nowhere near ready for real flight. But the sight of those leathery pinions beating at the air stirred Joan's memory of riding Rhaegal, of the rush of wind beneath a dragon's wings. He realized with a quiet thrill that one day, this creature might carry him through the skies again. But that future felt both exhilarating and perilous. For now, the secret remained his alone. In that same span of days, winter's grip tightened. Blizzards blew in from the far north, piling snowdrifts around Castle Black. The cold seeped into every crack, and even the brothers who had known the wall for years found themselves cursing the ferocity of the winds. Fires burned day and night in the great hall, men huddling around them to stave off numbness. Yet John actually began to welcome the added chill. It gave him an excuse to gather extra wood, to linger near fires, to slip away under the pretense of checking the fort's older structures for storm damage. All the while he returned to the hatchling, stoking the chamber's hearth until the stones radiated heat. The dragon thrived under that steady warmth, each day shedding a bit more of its newborn fragility. But secrecy took its toll on John's nerves. Some nights he found it difficult to sleep, his mind churning with possibilities. The hatchling was beginning to make more noise. Small cries, hisses, the occasional throaty rumble. Especially when hungry or restless. He worried that someone passing overhead might hear unusual echoes in the floor. So far, the castle's howling wind masked most sounds, but as the creature grew, so would its voice. He considered telling at least one other person, someone he trusted implicitly, but who? Sam was far away at the Citadel. Tormund roamed with free folk beyond the wall. There was no one at Castle Black he felt entirely sure of. Even so, bearing this secret alone was a heavy burden. On one particularly fierce night, the wind rattled the fortress with alarming intensity. The yard was blanketed in near whiteout conditions. Most men had taken refuge inside, playing dice games or trying to sleep until the worst passed. John, however, braved the storm with his hood pulled low, cloak whipping around his ankles. He carried a small sack of fresh rabbit meat, his footsteps nearly erased by the gale. Reaching the battered door, he wrestled it open against the wind, then descended carefully into the darkness below. Inside the hidden cells, the temperature was marginally better, though a biting draft seeped through cracks in the stone. John approached the hearth, heart sinking at the sight of the fire reduced to feeble embers. The hatchling lay curled in its nest of furs, body coiled tight. When it spotted him, it lifted its head and hissed, clearly upset by the sudden cold. Swiftly, John set about rebuilding the fire. He used the last of the wood he'd stashed, piling it into the grate, and coaxed the coals into new flames. Sparks flew, and soon a nascent warmth spread. The dragon inched closer, peering at the flames as though enthralled by the flicker of orange. John suspected that it sensed a kinship with the fire, some ancestral memory of the Valyrian blood that coursed through its veins. While the logs caught flame, John fed the hatchling bits of fresh rabbit. It devoured them hungrily, gulping chunks nearly as large as its head. After a few bites, it paused to let out a small coughing grunt, and out came the first wisp of flame, a tiny tendril of fire that danced from its throat and vanished in an instant. John froze, eyes wide. He almost dropped the meat in surprise. The hatchling blinked, tilting its head as if uncertain what had just happened. Then it tried again, a small cough lurch that sent another flicker of flame across the air before sputtering out. John felt a shiver course through his body, half excitement, half trepidation. The dragon was truly coming into its nature, learning to produce flame. It was so small now that the fire it conjured seemed almost comical, but that would not remain the case forever. In time, the hatchling's flame might be strong enough to blacken steel and melt flesh. The power that lurked inside this creature was awe-inspiring. At the same time, it made John realize that controlling such power, harnessing it responsibly, was no simple matter. If word spread that a new dragon was growing in the north, all manner of opportunists and enemies would descend upon Castle Black. He swallowed hard, running a hand through his tousled hair. He had chosen this path, and there would be consequences. Still, he couldn't help but smile softly at the hatchling's attempts. It coughed again, a puff of black smoke curling from its nostrils. For all its fierce heritage, it was merely a child in the ways of the world. John resumed feeding it, once more marveling at how quickly the small beast consumed the rabbit pieces. Afterward, he placed more wood on the hearth, ensuring a hearty blaze would last for a while. The hatchling, belly full, sidled closer to him. He felt the brush of its scaly flank against his forearm. Its small head craned upward, and it emitted a low crooning sound. John interpreted it as a request for comfort. Carefully, he extended his fingers, letting them graze the tiny ridge between its eyes. It closed its lids, seeming to enjoy the touch, and nuzzled his palm. A pang of tenderness rippled through him. He remembered another bond he once shared. Ghost as a pup, all red eyes and soft white fur, pressing against him in trust. Now, fate had placed a creature of fire in his care. Despite all the regrets and scars in his past, in moments like this, he felt something akin to hope. Perhaps his purpose was not finished when the Night King fell. Perhaps it was only beginning. Time wore on, and the storm above continued to rage. John lingered longer than he had planned, coaxing the hatchling to take a few more bites, adjusting the furs around it, and ensuring the warmth reached every corner of the small chamber. At one point, Ghost nudged the door open and padded in, shaking off flakes of snow. The direwolf approached cautiously, nose quivering. The hatchling hissed, lifting its wings in a half-threat. Ghost paused, ears twitching, then let out a soft whine. That whine seemed to calm the dragon, which lowered its wings with a wary flick. The two creatures regarded each other from a short distance, Ghost with canine caution, the dragon with reptilian suspicion. John observed them tensely, but neither advanced beyond a mutual curiosity. It was an uneasy truce for now. He gently called Ghost back to his side, not wanting to spark any conflict in that cramped space. Eventually, practical concerns forced John to action. Dawn would come soon enough, and the men would expect him on the training grounds. With a resigned sigh, he banked the fire so it would last a few hours, then secured the makeshift latch on the door. The hatchling let out a small cry as he turned to leave, and he glanced back, feeling an ache in his chest. He knelt to stroke the dragon's head once more. "I'll return soon," he murmured, though the creature could not understand. Even so, it blinked and settled back onto the furs. Ghost slipped past the doorway, casting one last curious look. John closed the door behind them, stepping into the cold corridor where the wind whistled through cracks in the stone. In the days that followed, signs of the hatchling's growth became even more apparent. Its limbs, once spindly, filled out with firm muscle. The wings, still too small for flight, stretched and flapped often, as though testing the limits of the cramped room. The color of its scales started to shift subtly, revealing deep emerald undertones beneath the glossy black. When the firelight struck just right, John discovered that it loved the heat. Sometimes he'd find it curled almost inside the hearth, an impossible closeness to the flame that made him worry it might burn itself. But the dragon's hide seemed impervious to normal flame, forging a close bond with the element that birthed it. He also noticed a developing intelligence behind those golden eyes. The hatchling recognized routines, feeding time, the noise of Joan's footsteps, even certain gestures. Once, John startled it by entering too abruptly, and it released a thin jet of flame in panic. Though it sputtered quickly, it singed the hem of Joan's cloak. Afterward, the dragon seemed contrite, nudging John's leg as though in apology. John knelt, placing a hand on its snout, and uttered soft reassurances. The experience served as a reminder. The creature was still wild at its core, a living embodiment of raw power. Earning its trust was only half the battle. Forging discipline and understanding would be the true challenge. Meanwhile, suspicion around Castle Black began to brew. A few brothers asked why John spent so much time in the old lower levels. He deflected with excuses about a leak in the storerooms or the need to search for hidden food reserves. Each time he lied, he felt a tightening in his gut, but he saw no alternative. He suspected that one or two stewards had even tried following him, but thus far, luck was on his side, and he'd managed to slip away undetected. The ephemeral sense of being hunted weighed on him, forcing him to adopt more caution. He started choosing different times to visit the hatchling. Sometimes late at night, sometimes in the small hours before dawn, occasionally midday if the yard was chaotic enough to hide his absence. He also noticed Ghost developing a new wariness. The dire wolf often accompanied him below ground, but showed signs of unease around the dragon's lair. At times, Ghost hovered near the chamber's entrance, ears perked, as if sensing a presence that went deeper than mere physical space. John wondered if the direwolf's old instincts, those connected to the ancient magic of the north, were clashing with the primal fire that coursed through the dragon's veins. Still, Ghost never attacked or growled. He simply kept his distance when the hatchling paced or tested its growing flame. John offered the wolf gentle words, grateful that his longtime companion had not rejected him or the dragon outright. As the second moon cycle since the dragon's birth neared, Joan's secret weighed heavier on him. The hatchling was larger, more vocal, and required increasing quantities of meat. Hunting expeditions became more frequent. Once, he nearly collided with a party of rangers returning from a patrol as he tried to slip through the gates with a sack of freshly killed hares. He managed a plausible excuse that he'd been helping out a friend near Mole's town. The rangers accepted his words, though one older man eyed him with a hint of suspicion. John realized then that the ruse might not hold forever. Despite these risks, he couldn't bring himself to abandon the dragon or turn it over to any authority. He felt a creeping sense that they were bound in a way that transcended logic or duty. The hatchling recognized him as a caretaker, and perhaps more. When John entered the chamber, the dragon's eyes lit up with recognition, and it would approach him, pressing its scaled head to his chest in greeting. He would stroke the ridges around its neck, murmuring soft words of encouragement. The warmth of that contact resonated deep inside him. He remembered old words about how dragons bonded with riders, about how Targaryens once walked the line between man and beast through that bond. He had no illusions that this bond would be simple to maintain, but for now the trust they shared was enough to keep him going. Night after night, John tried to patch the cracks in the chamber wall, to keep out the worst of the drafts and to dull the noise within. He mixed mud and straw to fill larger gaps, hammered spare planks against crevices, and constructed a rough wood barrier behind the door. The dragon often watched these efforts with curiosity, snorting little bursts of flame that danced above the straw. John scolded it gently. There was a time and place for flame, and that place was not on the flimsy barrier that might protect them both. He also found himself talking to the dragon as though it might answer. At times, the hatchling tilted its head, as if listening. John spoke of the past. How he had once believed himself just a bastard of House Stark. How he had learned of his Targaryen blood. What that had cost him, and how he found himself here in a fortress of ice and stone. He confided half-formed regrets about leaving those he loved, about the battles fought, the people lost. And though the hatchling did not speak, John believed it sensed his sorrow and his hope. It would crawl closer, rest its scaled chin on his leg, and sigh in a way that almost sounded human. Weeks slipped by in this secret dance. The wind howled across the top of the wall, carrying stinging ice crystals that scoured the ramparts. Each morning, Castle Black men trudged about their tasks, oblivious to the life stirring in the depths below. And each night, John and Ghost braved the cold to descend the hidden stair, their hearts pounding, to nurture the fragile, miraculous spark of a new dragon. At times, John was certain he saw a flicker of doubt or curiosity in the eyes of certain brothers, as if they sensed something amiss. Yet for the moment, no one confronted him openly. He prayed that luck would hold a while longer. One dusk, as he crouched by the hearth, carefully adjusting the logs to maintain an even heat, the dragon suddenly lifted its head, nostrils flaring. Ghost too stiffened, his ears pricking alertly. John froze, listening tightly. From somewhere beyond the walls, faint but distinct, came the echo of footsteps. More than one pair. They were accompanied by voices, muffled, but drawing closer to the corridor outside. John's blood ran cold. He snuffed the lantern immediately, leaving the chamber lit only by the dim glow of the fire. Heart hammering, he carefully guided the dragon behind the makeshift wood barrier. The creature let out a protesting hiss, confused by the abrupt shift from warmth and comfort. Ghost pressed close to John, silent and taut as a coiled spring. The footsteps approached the rotted door. Light flickered in the corridor, likely a torch or lantern. Someone rattled the door handle, testing it. "It's locked?" a voice said. "Didn't know we had a locked door down here." John's stomach twisted. Another voice chimed in. "Maybe it's collapsed inside. Or maybe the old folks locked it for a reason." There was a brief scraping sound, as though they tried to pry the latch free. John remained perfectly still, feeling the dragon's trembling weight pressed against his leg. Ghost let out the faintest rumble of warning in his throat, which John quickly hushed with a hand on the wolf's fur. Moments ticked by with agonizing slowness. The men on the other side spoke in low tones. At last, one said, "Don't want to mess with it now. If it's locked, it's locked. Could be a nest of rats in there. Let's check the next corridor." With that, the footsteps receded, and the light in the crack under the door faded. John waited, not daring to breathe, until the faint echoes vanished entirely. Only then did he exhale shakily, feeling the cold sweat on his brow. The dragon peeked out from behind the barrier, eyes wide, pupils dilated in fear or excitement. John whispered gentle reassurances, stroking the creature's flank, but his own heart still raced, the weight of near discovery pressing on him. That night, sleep eluded him completely. Lying on his cot, he stared at the dark ceiling, replaying the moment those voices came so close to discovering his secret. It was only a matter of time before curiosity, or a stronger sense of duty, led someone to break down that door. Or perhaps the men were merely wandering, idle in their tasks. But next time they might not give up so easily. The stark reality pressed on him. He couldn't hide a growing dragon in the castle forever. Eventually, the truth would out. Morning brought no easy answers, only the daily grind of the watch. John swung a training sword against practice dummies, his moves mechanical, his mind elsewhere. What would happen when the dragon was too big to keep under a fur blanket in a hidden room? The thought of letting it fly free beyond the wall was terrifying. An untrained young dragon could wreak havoc or fall prey to unknown dangers. Yet staying at Castle Black seemed less viable with each passing day. He found himself scanning the horizon, imagining places where a dragon might grow safely. Perhaps in the frost fangs among high crags and hidden valleys. Or further south, in the mountains near the Vale, though that would invite the eyes of the lords of the Eyrie. The concept of traveling so far with a young dragon daunted him. But staying was no longer safe for either one of them. For the time being, however, he had no choice but to maintain the status quo. The storms raged on. The nights remained long. Each time he descended to the hidden cells, the dragon greeted him with bright eyes and a flick of its tail, as if to say it believed in him, that it trusted him to keep it secure. John felt a wrench of guilt that he hadn't devised a better solution. So he threw himself into reinforcing the door, adding an interior brace that might hold out a bit longer if someone tried forcing entry. He also considered ways to muffle the dragon's ever louder cries. Shredded cloth stuffed into cracks, more planks, anything that might trap sound. Yet each fix felt temporary, a delaying tactic. The hatchling, now nearly the size of a small dog, tested its voice often. It would trill or rumble whenever John arrived, and if it was hungry, it could produce a shriek that echoed ominously. John took to feeding it quickly as soon as he arrived, hoping to quiet its demands. The dragon learned to associate the opening of the door with mealtime, scuttling toward him with surprising speed. He forced himself to remain calm and hush it gently. He even tried to teach it signals, raising a hand in a pacifying gesture whenever it grew too vocal, rewarding it with a morsel of meat when it quieted. It was uncertain if it comprehended, but over time, it seemed to calm more readily, as though it understood that quietness brought reward. Still, the tension throughout Castle Black was growing. Whispers circulated of strange noises in the night, of ghostly moans beneath the fortress floors. John heard fragments of conversation. Might be ice shifting. Could be the wind carrying from the caverns. Heard it near the old cells, but I wasn't about to explore that alone. Each rumor tightened the knot in John's stomach. He had dreaded this exact scenario. Men who had nothing better to do in the gloom of winter often turned to ghost stories, and if a handful of them decided to investigate, everything would unravel. He was forced to ration the dragon's feeding times, waiting until Castle Black was at its busiest or, ironically, at its deepest hush. Day by day, night by night, he played this precarious game, always one misstep away from discovery. Through it all, the bond between him and the dragon grew stronger. The more time he spent with the hatchling, the more he sensed it recognized him not just as caretaker, but as something akin to a parent or partner. It even attempted to follow him a few times when he headed for the door, letting out plaintive cries. He had to gently push it back, murmuring soothing words, promising he would return. Each time, the look in those golden eyes wrenched his heart. On a night when the wind was mercifully calm, John found himself in the chamber once again, kneeling by the hearth. The dragon, now heavier and more muscular, stood beside him, sniffing at the flames. Its wings were half extended, the tips brushing the walls. The place was growing too small. John laid a hand on its back, feeling the warmth thrumming beneath the scales. He exhaled, a wave of conflicting emotions building in his chest. How long until the next near discovery? How long could he keep lying to the men had once sworn to lead? The dragon, sensing his turmoil, lifted its head and nudged his shoulder. A faint chirp escaped its throat, almost a question. John turned, meeting the creature's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wish I had an answer, but we'll figure it out." He gently stroked the ridge above the dragon's eye. The hatchling let out a soft sigh, sidling closer. A bittersweet ache filled him. He had never asked for this role, yet he had claimed it the instant he decided to hatch that egg. The old tale spoke of the bond between dragon and rider as something transcendent, forged in fire. Now he was living that reality, and the weight of it pressed upon him like a double-edged sword. He couldn't shake the feeling that a reckoning was near. Whether it came by steel or by rumor, or by necessity, something would force him to reveal what he had done. Perhaps he might flee, taking the dragon beyond the wall or to some remote stronghold. Or perhaps he would stand his ground and declare the creature's existence openly, daring any to challenge his right. The conflict in his heart raged, part duty to the night's watch, part Targaryen heritage demanding he embrace the legacy of dragons. In the hush of that hidden chamber, he felt both entirely alone and intimately connected to the small life at his side. He realized then that no matter what the future held, whether the men of the Watch condemned him or the southern lords rose against him, he could not betray this dragon. Blood of his blood, fire made flesh. It was the last link to a lost line of kings, and also a symbol of new beginnings. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead lightly against the creature's scaled neck. It rumbled in its throat, a comforting resonance. For a long moment, they simply existed there, man and dragon, united by warmth in a cold, uncertain world. At length, Jon pulled back, burying his restless thoughts. Practicalities demanded his attention. He needed to gather more wood, perhaps craft a better feeding plan. But as he moved to stand, the dragon extended a wing, gently brushing it against his arm, as if it sought closeness. Jon paused, smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He patted its side, letting it know he was not leaving just yet. Tonight, for a little while longer, he would stay and share the glow of the fire. Outside, the world might be poised on the brink of revelation. Here, in the hidden cell, the hush was broken only by the crackle of flames and the quiet heartbeat of a secret that grew stronger with every breath. Oh! Jon remained in the secret chamber longer than usual that evening, well past the hour when he would normally slip away. Despite the risk, he could not bring himself to leave the dragon alone in the flickering glow of the half-banked fire. More than ever, he felt the stirrings of an unspoken promise between them, that he would guard this living spark of House Targaryen, come what may. And yet, the gravity of the situation weighed on him like a physical burden. The baby dragon was bigger, hungrier, and increasingly restless. All the while, Castle Black harbored uneasy murmurs of strange noises and flickering lights in the undercellars. At last, he stood, smoothing the wrinkles in his worn black tunic. The dragon, sensing change, nudged his thigh with a soft grunt. In response, Jon laid a hand on its head. The scales felt warm and alive beneath his palm, pulsating with the quiet thrumming of a tiny but formidable heart. In those golden eyes he glimpsed an unmistakable intelligence, keen, searching, aware. For a fleeting instant, he imagined it grown to its full power, wings spanning half the length of a courtyard, overshadowing all who gazed upon it. But the reality was that it was still small enough to be vulnerable, and only the thick walls of this hidden cell kept it safe from the eyes and blades of men who would see it destroyed or captured. He crouched to speak to it softly. "I'll be back by dawn or sooner, if I can manage." Even though words did not truly matter, the tone, gentle, reassuring, did. The dragon's pupils narrowed, and it let out a tentative hiss that seemed neither hostile nor content, but something in between. Jon took that as understanding, or at least acceptance. Stepping back, he added a log to the embers for warmth, then adjusted the furs near the hearth. Ghost shifted near the doorway, pawing at a loose stone. Before he left, Jon placed a small wooden bowl of water beside the dragon. He wasn't sure if it would drink much. Dragons were said to derive much of their nourishment from meat, and eventually flame. But it felt negligent not to provide something. The beast sniffed at the water, then jerked its head away with a snort. Jon suppressed a weary grin. "All right, you're not thirsty. Still, it's there." He lifted the makeshift wooden brace from inside the door, just a few nails hammered into a length of board that wedged into the stone wall, and slid through the narrow opening. Ghost followed, muzzle low to the ground. In the corridor, darkness wrapped around them like a shroud. Jon paused, heart still pattering at the memory of the near discovery. Listening carefully, he heard nothing but the faint whisper of wind through cracks in the fortress foundation. The hour must be late enough that the men of the Night's Watch were either asleep or tucked in corners playing dice. He doused the torch in a small puddle at the corner of the corridor, letting his eyes adjust to the faint glow from above. Navigating these passages by memory was second nature now. Step by step, he and Ghost ascended the worn stair, mindful of creaky boards and stray rubble. Once they reached the top, Jon pressed his ear to the battered door. Silence. Slowly, he eased it open into a deserted section of the ground-level storeroom. Beyond the cracks in the boards, The winter moon cast a pallid light across the courtyard. He slipped outside, cloak pulled tight. The sky overhead was clear but starlit, the temperature biting enough to sear his lungs when he inhaled. Ghost padded at his side, footsteps muted by fresh snow. Each time John crossed this courtyard after visiting the dragon, he felt tension coil in his stomach, as though invisible watchers might be waiting. But the yard was empty. The only movement a swinging lantern that clanked softly against a post. John kept his head down, strode to his quarters, and let himself in. Inside, the room was chilly, scarcely warmer than the night air. He shut the door behind Ghost, lighted a stub of candle on the rickety desk, and then let out a quiet sigh. Nights had become fractions of real sleep, scattered between responsibilities and worry. He knew he could not endure indefinitely in such a state. Yet each time he dozed off, he dreamed of the dragon, its presence filling the darkness behind his eyelids with swirling plumes of smoke and the thunderous promise of wings. He lowered himself to the cot, not bothering to remove his boots. The straw pallet rustled, and Ghost settled beside him. He shut his eyes, trying to gather a few hours of rest before the next day's demands fell upon him. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe two, a soft rap came at the door, followed by a low voice. "John, are you awake?" "Dan rest tomorrow." He jerked upright, heart pounding as though he'd been caught in a misdeed. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, he recognized the voice. It belonged to Darren, a steward who'd arrived at Castle Black barely a year past. A quiet man with a stooped posture. John drew a shaky breath. "Yes, I'm awake." "What is it?" "Through the door," the steward replied. "There's an issue in the library. Some of the older shelves collapsed. They're asking for help clearing the debris." John rose, pressing a hand to his temple. He felt a surge of annoyance tinged with relief. At least the reason was mundane. "I'll be right there." He glanced at Ghost, who blinked sleepily. The dire wolf flicked an ear as if to say, "Another chore?" John gave a small shrug and slipped on his cloak again. Satisfying one's duties was part of keeping up appearances after all. In the library's lower room, he found a cluster of black-clad brothers staring at a leaning shelf that had crashed against another, sending manuscripts and decaying parchments sliding everywhere. The men greeted him with fatigue-laced nods. No one enjoyed sorting through ancient, half-rotten records in the small hours. John immediately waded into the mess, stacking wooden planks to one side, setting aside salvageable scrolls to the other. He recognized a few of the titles: outdated genealogies, partial accounts of old battles, a treatise on the building of the wall. The work was monotonous enough to let his mind wander. As he sifted through the debris, he stumbled on a battered tome whose spine was embossed with the faint outline of a dragon. The print was barely legible, worn down by time, but he made out the word Valyria. Setting the book aside to examine later, he focused on the cleanup. If he lingered too long, the others might grow curious about his interest. It took the better part of 2 hours to set the library to rights, or at least to prevent further collapse. By then, dawn tinged the eastern sky with a weak gray light. The brothers dispersed, some muttering about breakfast, others returning to their bunks. John cradled the battered Valyrian tome in his arms and made for his quarters, wanting a moment's peace to glance through it. Once inside, he dropped onto his cot and squinted at the tattered pages in the thin morning light. The text was mostly in an archaic form of the common tongue, with occasional lines of High Valyrian interspersed. Sketches of dragons adorned some margins, so faint that he had to run his finger along the lines to make them out. He spotted references to dragon handling, particularly in times of conflict. While the details were incomplete, a passage about eerily rearing of hatchlings caught his eye. The ink was smudged, and entire sections were missing, but he deciphered enough to glean that hatchlings not raised in warm climates often needed artificially heated enclosures, with special care to maintain high temperatures. This only reinforced what he already knew. The North was no natural home for a dragon. He read further, discovering a note that Valyrians would sometimes feed their dragons spiced wine or mulled concoctions, laced with potent herbs, said to strengthen the dragon's inner fire. That part sounded suspiciously like hearsay or old superstition, but he made a mental note in case it proved relevant. He closed the book at last, exhaustion seeping into his limbs. Too many secrets, too many responsibilities. The faint clamor of men heading to the mess hall for breakfast floated through his window. Another day of watch duty, training, record-keeping. And all the while, the hidden life below. If only he had some counsel, someone to share in the burden. But no. He reminded himself that any slip of the tongue could doom the hatchling. He forced himself to eat a small meal of bread and boiled eggs, then reported to the practice yard. There, half a dozen younger brothers awaited sword drills. John took them through formations with dulled steel, correcting stances and footwork, pretending all was as it should be. In truth, his mind drifted. He visualized the dragon alone in the dank chamber, waiting for him to bring fresh food, perhaps pacing the narrow space with growing impatience. By midday, sweat slicked his brow from the physical exertion, and the recruits were panting from repeated drills. Satisfied they'd learned enough for one session, John dismissed them. He paused to speak with a few who lingered, fielding questions about how best to defend against overhead strikes. When they finally departed, he found himself alone with only Ghost at the far edge of the yard. A few older rangers sparred on the opposite side, too preoccupied to note Joan's comings and goings. He seized the moment to check on the hatchling. Stepping quietly, he slipped back into the old storeroom corridor. Inside, the stale air weighed heavily, as though pressing him deeper into secrecy. He descended the steps until the darkness swallowed him. His footfalls echoed off the stone walls, and a trickle of moisture dripped from overhead. The battered door creaked faintly under his hand as he pushed it open, mindful of the brace. At once he heard scuffling from within. The dragon darted forward, letting out an eager hiss as if to scold him for his absence. It was midday after all, and feeding time was well overdue. John quickly set down a small sack of scraps he'd smuggled from the kitchen. Chunks of chicken, sausage trimmings, and a bit of leftover mutton. Not the freshest fare, but better than nothing. The hatchling latched onto a piece of mutton, jaws snapping hungrily. John noted with amazement how easily it tore the flesh now. Its jaws had grown stronger, the teeth sharper. He moved closer to the dragon, crouching beside the warm hearth. The fire had nearly died, only faint embers glowing. He stooped to rebuild it with bits of kindling, half an eye on the hatchling, as it devoured another chunk of meat. "Slow down," John murmured. "You'll choke." The dragon ignored him, gulping greedily. After finishing the last strip of sausage, it flicked its tail in apparent satisfaction, a contented rumble rising from its throat. John stretched a hand toward it, letting his palm rest against the ridge between its wings. Heat pulsed beneath those scales, a living furnace. He felt the quick hammer of its heartbeat, and thought again of the old Valerians who had soared above the world with beasts like this. Could it be fate that he ended up here, with a dragon of his own, however small and hidden? After tidying the hearth and ensuring a steady flame, he inspected the chamber. He frowned at the stale air, stale water, the walls that seemed to sweat cold. Though he'd done his best to seal cracks, the room was far from an ideal nursery. His gaze fell upon the dragon's droppings in one corner, already partially frozen. The idea that this was an environment for a creature of fire rankled him. "We can't keep doing this," he said softly, addressing not just the dragon but the walls themselves. "You deserve better, and we're running out of time." The dragon seemed to sense his unease, padding over to sniff his tunic. John carefully stroked its neck, a swirl of guilt and concern tightening in his chest. He could not simply remain hidden forever. The memory of footsteps outside the door, the near discovery, haunted him. One day soon, a more persistent search party would pry open the locked door. Or the dragon, in a burst of restlessness, might unleash a roar or a gout of flame that no planked barrier could fully muffle. He let out a heavy breath. A choice loomed. He could attempt to flee Castle Black with the dragon, traveling north or south in search of a safe haven. But the logistics of that. A small voice in his head mocked the impossibility. The north was harsh, and the free folk might not welcome a new dragon, no matter who carried it. South, the politics were complicated. Many lords would see a dragon as a threat to the delicate peace that had settled after so many wars. And if the Seven Kingdoms discovered that another Targaryen scion lived, raising a dragon in secret, it could ignite a fresh storm of ambition or fear. Yet every time he considered revealing the truth to the brothers, he recoiled. The Night's Watch was not what it once was, but plenty of men still despised anything to do with magic or Targaryen claims. They had seen dragons in the Great War, yes, but also witnessed how destructive they could be. Even if they did not kill the hatchling outright, word would spread. The secret would be no more. And Jon still sensed that the realm was not ready for such knowledge. Perhaps it never would be. He remained there, lost in thought, until the dragon nudged him with its muzzle, almost impatient. He glanced down to see that it was rooting at the empty sack, obviously hoping for more food. "That's all for now," he said. "I can't be hauling half the kitchens down here without someone asking questions. You'll have to wait until tonight." A slight puff of smoke dribbled from the dragon's nostrils, as though in protest. Jon couldn't help but smile wryly. "Don't give me that look." He rose, dusting off his knees. "I'll bring fresh meat soon." The creature snapped its jaws, then trotted back toward the warmth of the fire, wings half raised in that odd, unsettled posture. Jon took one last look around, ensuring no sign of fresh damage, then departed with Ghost. Time pressed on, and winter's harshness showed no sign of relenting. Storm after storm pummeled the wall, burying Castle Black in white drifts that rose almost to the parapets. Some days the snow fell so heavily that men dared not leave the fortress, huddling instead in the common hall or scattered rooms. The storerooms were running low, forcing the watch to ration bread and salt pork. Tensions rose in tandem with the howling wind. Brothers quarreled over petty grievances. Arguments broke out over minor chores. A certain gloom lingered, an unspoken question of whether the watch even served a vital purpose anymore. Now that the White Walkers were defeated, Jon navigated these days on edge, balancing his old vow to protect the realm with his new, self-imposed vow to protect the dragon. Each day, he found a pretext to slip away, though the severity of the weather made it increasingly difficult to roam beyond the castle. Hunting for fresh game became a painful struggle against the elements. Once, he nearly lost his way in a whiteout and had to rely on Ghost's uncanny senses to guide him back to the gate. Another time, he sustained frostbite on 2 fingers, saved only by submerging them in lukewarm water, for what felt like hours upon his return. The dragon grew hungrier by the day. Its bulk increased steadily, thickening in the chest and limbs, tail lengthening, wing bones strengthening. Gone was the delicate hatchling that once struggled to crack its own shell. Now it moved with a sinuous grace, claws scraping stone with quiet confidence. Its horns were more pronounced, curving back along its skull, and the subtle green undertones in its black scales had become more noticeable near the edges of each scale, catching the firelight in mesmerizing patterns. Jon saw all of this with a mixture of pride and dread. Pride that the creature was thriving under his care, dread that it would soon be impossible to conceal. Already, the small chamber felt cramped, the dragon's wing tips brushing the walls if it spread them fully. Worse still, the dragon's voice had deepened to a resonant warble that carried alarmingly well when it grew excited. He did what he could to hush it, offering scraps of meat the moment it started to vocalize, but the day would come when no bribe of food could silence its roars. One bitter evening, Jon sat cross-legged on the chamber floor, feeding the dragon a trio of rabbits he'd managed to snare. Outside, the wind raged, rattling the door and funneling cold air into the corridor. The meager firelight cast shifting shadows on the wall, turning the small room into a cave of flickering gloom. Ghost rested near the threshold, ears pricked. As the dragon tore into its meal, Jon couldn't help but notice its near-feral hunger. Blood spattered across its jaws, and it devoured bone and flesh alike with single-minded vigor. The crack of rabbit bones echoed in the confined space. Jon found himself thinking of the old stories, how Targaryens claimed that dragons were no simple pets, no docile beasts, but savage forces of nature. He watched the creature gulp the last morsel, then lick its muzzle with a slender forked tongue. When it finished, it padded over to Jon, sniffing his hands as though to check if more food were forthcoming. John gave a resigned shake of his head. "You've eaten everything." Greedily, as always. He stroked its neck, noticing how the scales rose and fell with each breath. The creature's chest radiated heat. As it exhaled, a faint swirl of steam coiled in the cold air. Something in the dragon's posture struck him as restless. It paced a few steps toward the fireplace, then turned abruptly and paced back, tail swishing. John recognized the signs. It wanted more space. A place to stretch, to move. He couldn't provide that here. Every day that passed, the need for open air grew stronger. He wondered if the dragon ever dreamed of flying. In his own memories, riding Rhaegal had been an indescribable rush. This hatchling bore those same gifts in its blood, but was trapped beneath Castle Black's floor like a caged hawk. John felt an ache in his chest. He touched the dragon's flank, letting his fingertips brush the place just behind the forelimbs, where he suspected flight muscles would develop further. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The creature cocked its head, golden eyes reflecting the firelight. John looked away, feeling guilt coil in his gut. He had already lingered too long. The hour was late, and men sometimes wandered after dinner in search of a quiet place to brood or talk. If they heard the dragon's pacing or its low huffs, this fragile secret would be undone. With a heavy heart, John added a log to the fire and backed away. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said softly, though it never felt like enough. The dragon let out a brief huff, smoky breath curling around its nostrils, but it did not follow. Something in its posture suggested resignation as well. He slipped out, replaced the brace, and found Ghost waiting in the corridor. Without a word, they climbed to ground level, where the wind whistled through cracks in the outer wall. Once in the courtyard, John squinted at the swirling snow. He cursed the relentless cold under his breath. The storms had continued for days without respite. A few brothers stumbled by, arms laden with firewood. They hardly gave John a second look. He strode to his chamber, ignoring the gnaw of hunger in his own belly. Inside, he found only gloom and the promise of another sleepless night. The next morning the sun never truly rose, only a dim gray half-light filtered through thick clouds, leaving the fortress in near twilight well past midday. Men ate a dull breakfast of oat mash and dried fish, scarcely speaking. An oppressive hush had settled over Castle Black. The hiss of wind was constant, an inescapable presence that wore at the nerves. John performed his duties, organizing a small party to clear snow from the walkways. He helped them shovel drift after drift, sweat chilling on his skin. Inwardly, he welcomed the labor. It kept his mind and body occupied, held the creeping dread at bay. When the chores ended, he made for the stables, intending to check on the horses. Even though few rides were possible in such weather, the beasts still needed attention. He found a stable hand, Wick, already busy brushing down a fretful mare. We nodded curtly at John, then went back to his work. John knelt beside another horse, examining its hooves for ice-packed lumps. The stable smelled of hay, manure, and horseflesh, oddly comforting compared to the stale cold air outside. As he worked, he caught snippets of conversation from two brothers leaning against a stall further down. They didn't seem to notice him. "Swear I heard something like a beast roaring under the floors last night," said one, his voice low. Not a man's voice. More like a monstrous cat. Joan's stomach lurched. The other brother scoffed. "Might just be the wind through a crack. Or maybe you were drunk on that sour ale." But the first insisted, "I know what I heard. It wasn't wind, and it sure as the seven hells wasn't a rat. I nearly pissed myself." John forced himself to keep his hands steady, checking the horse's left hoof, as though he heard nothing. His heart pounded in his ears. Men were hearing the dragon's cries. All the patchwork illusions, wind, shifting ice, were wearing thin. He eased the horse's hoof back down, gave it a reassuring pat, and then stood. Wick glanced at him but said nothing. John offered a curt nod, stepping away. He needed time to think, to breathe. Outside the stable, the wind slapped his face with icy needles. He pulled his cloak tight, trudging across the yard. He might have tried to find solace in the library or in a quiet corner of the wall walk. but his thoughts spiraled with urgency. The risk was escalating. If one man had heard the dragon, others would soon do the same, and rumor would intensify their curiosity. He found himself drifting toward the gate, which stood half buried in drifted snow. The watchman on duty had carved a narrow path through the piled whiteness, enough to come and go if needed. John stepped outside the walls briefly, letting the fierce wind buffet him. Beyond the watch's torches, the white wastes sprawled in every direction. A memory tugged at him. The freedom beyond the wall, the wild forests, the open skies. Once more, he pictured taking the dragon north, away from prying eyes. But the savage storms made even that a slim prospect. Winter had locked the land in ice. The hatchling might not survive a trek through such punishing cold, not unless John built some kind of heated enclosure for it, which was impossible on the move. He might be able to lead it on foot or by horse, but the entire endeavor felt doomed. Returning inside, he shook the snow from his cloak and headed back to his quarters. Along the way, he passed a few men who gave him perfunctory nods. Their faces were drawn, eyes ringed with fatigue. Winter hammered them all, body and spirit. His mind churned with possible plans, none of which seemed viable. He paused by a brazier in the yard, warming his hands against the coals. The simplest solution might be to flee south with the dragon, aiming for some remote castle or hidden valley. But the south was hardly safer. Lords would demand answers. Rumors would spread like wildfire, and soon powerful men might see advantage in controlling a living dragon. John pictured it in shackles, or caged behind thick iron bars. The notion made his stomach twist. He would not allow that. He returned to his room, rubbing his temples as he sank onto the edge of the cot. Ghost curled at his feet, sensing his master's tension. The candle on the desk flickered. The battered Valyrian tome, head salvaged from the library, still lay there, open to a dog-eared page depicting rough sketches of whelps feeding in a broad pit. He eyed the text, reading again the half-legible notes. Something about Dragon Pit, a controlled environment in old Valyria or perhaps in King's Landing centuries ago, used to raise and train dragons in captivity. Could a smaller version of that be devised here? But how and where? Under these conditions. He shut the book with a sigh. The day wore on in a haze of worry. He forced himself to go about the typical tasks. He inspected the ramparts, exchanged a few words with the current Lord Commander, an older man named Mallister, chosen by default after the ranks had thinned so severely. Mallister rarely questioned John's activities, content with his help wherever it was offered. John maintained a polite distance, never revealing more than was needed. He took meals with the men, half listening to the quiet talk. The rumor of strange noises persisted, though not everyone believed the tales. Some scoffed at the idea of hidden creatures, chalking it up to wild imaginations. Others, though, wore unsettled frowns. As dusk settled, John slipped away again, down the steps, through the battered door, into the half-lit cell. The moment he entered, he noticed something was off. The door had shifted slightly, as if it had been nudged or pulled. Inside, the dragon was at the far side of the room, wings partly unfurled in agitation. Ghost growled low, sniffing the threshold. John's breath caught. Had someone tried to open the door in his absence? He examined the latch and brace. They were in place, but appeared jostled. A faint scrape on the stone floor suggested the door had been forcibly tested. Fear jolted him. He turned to the dragon, which hissed softly, as though complaining of the intrusion. "Easy," John said under his breath, approaching slowly. He placed a hand on the creature's neck, feeling the tension in its muscles. The dragon's eyes roved toward the door, gold flecks shimmering with primal wariness. "We can't stay like this much longer, can we?" The dragon made a low rumble, pressing its head into his hand. John closed his eyes, leaning forward until his forehead touched the dragon's skull. A swirl of heat enveloped him, the beast's breath rolling across his cheek. He remained there for a moment, letting the fear settle, trying to gather resolve. "I'll protect you," he murmured, "no matter what." He fed it quickly with bits of salted pork he'd stolen from the kitchens, then built up the fire again. The anxiety gnawed at him, but the dragon's presence anchored him for a little while. When the creature finished eating, it stretched in the narrow space, flapping its wings in a half-formed attempt at flight. The gust of wind from the motion stirred the dust in the room, and a burst of flame nearly shot from its jaws in excitement. John startled, gently pushing its head down. "Not here," he hissed. "Not so close to the ceiling." The dragon snorted, a flare of ember-laced breath seeping from its nostrils. He realized then how risky every hour had become. Soon, a single roar or puff of flame might betray them. One slip would be enough. He stared at the small creature before him, though not so small anymore, and felt the weight of the decision he had to make. If he stayed, they would almost certainly be discovered. If he fled, the winter storms could kill them both. If he went south, the dragon might fall prey to political schemes and powerful lords. None of the paths were safe, but the time to choose was coming fast. After a while, he tore himself away from the dragon's side and returned to the courtyard. The cold sank deep into his bones, a cruel contrast to the living heat he'd just left. He trudged toward the armory, passing a pair of watchmen who gave him polite nods. Inside, the armory was lit by a lone lantern, revealing racks of weapons, swords, spears, axes in various states of repair. A single blacksmith hammered away at a piece of steel. John recognized him, Daniel, a gruff older man who rarely spoke more than a word or two. John made a show of examining some of the older swords, as though assessing them for repairs. He needed to be seen doing everyday tasks, to dispel any suspicion that he was disappearing too often. But even as he pretended to inspect the steel, his thoughts coiled around the same dilemma. Perhaps he could orchestrate a plan to lead the dragon out under cover of night, past the gates, and into the wide wilderness. The question was, to where, and how to keep it alive. The hatchling was strong but not large enough to hunt big game or breathe sustained fire. John would have to feed and protect it. He imagined building a shelter, traveling by short distances each night. The mental image felt riddled with pitfalls. After a few minutes, he set down the sword with a clang. Daniel glanced up, brow furrowed. John mustered a neutral expression. Nothing. Just a scratch in the blade. Daniel grunted and resumed hammering. John took that as his cue to leave. Stepping outside, he fought the urge to look over his shoulder, as if men's eyes were upon him. Another day bled into another night. Once again, John found himself descending to the hidden cell. Each time, the tension in his chest felt tighter, as if 100 watchers might be waiting around the next corner. He entered to find the dragon pacing, restless, tail lashing against the wall. He offered it the meager scraps he'd collected, a bit of goat's meat and half a rabbit. It ate without its usual fervor, as if bored by the monotony. When finished, it reared up on its hind legs briefly, flapping its wings. The wingtips nearly touched opposite walls. Dust and bits of mortar rained down. John set a steadying hand on its side, feeling the sleek muscle. "Too small for you now," he said, the words catching in his throat. The dragon's chest expanded, releasing a low sound like distant thunder. Then it turned away, rummaging at the corner, sniffing old stones as though searching for an exit. John watched with a pang of sadness. He knew that caging a dragon's spirit was unnatural. They were meant for the open sky, for flight and wind. He had done his best to keep it alive, but in doing so, he had imprisoned it here. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. "I'm sorry. Maybe we can move you somewhere better." His voice trembled slightly, the admission of a plan still forming in his head. The creature swung its head toward him, smoke curling at the edges of its nostrils. Yes, he decided. It was time to act, or else events would spiral out of his control. Even if the risk was great, waiting would only ensure the watch discovered the dragon on their own terms. Better that he try to guide the outcome. But how? The storms made travel nearly impossible. Taking a horse might help, but how to conceal a dragon on horseback? A sledge perhaps, with a crate or covering. The idea was half mad. He pictured crossing the haunted forests of the far north, building hidden fires to keep the dragon warm. He pictured the possibility of wildlings or hungry wolves stalking them. Still, the alternative was to remain until some curious brother pried open the door. Any illusions about the watch reaction vanished when John recalled the men in the stables talking of monstrous roars. They would approach with drawn steel, trembling but determined, and the dragon, frightened, might lash out with fire or teeth. Blood would be spilled. He could not allow that, not after everything. Late that night, after returning to his quarters, he found himself scribbling notes on a scrap of parchment, trying to sketch out a route. Perhaps if he headed west along the wall, to the shivering sea, or beyond to the frost fangs, he might find a remote cavern. But that trek would be brutal in winter. Another thought: travel due north to Hardhome or near where it once stood. The coast might allow for fishing or gathering driftwood, but Hardhome was a ruin, and the terrain was treacherous. His thoughts circled around the notion of a safer harbor. The notion of going south again flickered, a memory of the gift, that strip of land below the wall given to the watch. Much of it lay in farmland and rolling hills, also battered by winter. More eyes might be there, but perhaps scattered, not as concentrated as in a city. If he found an abandoned holdfast or a shack in the deep woods, he might hide the dragon until the worst of winter passed. Then, if it grew strong enough, maybe it could hunt on its own. The plan was paper thin, full of holes. He had no illusions that it would be easy, but all choices before him involved danger. After hours of fruitless brainstorming, he blew out the candle and tried to rest, though the tangle of ideas refused to let him slip into true sleep. 2 mornings later, a hush fell over Castle Black that was different from the usual gloom. The wind had died. Dawn broke with a fragile pale light, revealing the courtyard blanketed in fresh snow, untouched by swirling gusts. Men emerged, blinking at the relative calm. Some expressed relief. Others hurried to shovel while they had the chance. John felt an unexpected flicker of hope. If the wind truly stayed calm, maybe he could slip out with the dragon under cover of darkness that very night. He spent the day quietly gathering supplies, extra blankets, cured meats, a few flasks of water. He filched bandages and a small jar of salve from the infirmary in case of frostbite or minor wounds. Each item he hid in his chamber, wrapping them tightly in a rough sack. Ghost watched from the corner, tail occasionally thumping as if sensing a change. John also visited the stables, checking for a sturdy horse that might be up to the challenge of hauling a small cart. The stablemaster was preoccupied with sorting feed. John slipped by, locating a brown mare named Hazel that had proven resilient in earlier storms. She wasn't the largest horse, but she was steady. He would need that reliability if he were to tether a sled behind her. The next question was the sled itself. He found a small one stored behind the stables, likely used for hauling firewood in heavy snow. It was battered but serviceable, with runners thick enough to bear some weight. He tested it, scraping it across a patch of packed snow, and found it slid well enough. That evening, under the guise of storing the sled for future chores, he moved it near a side gate rarely used. The gate was locked, but not heavily guarded. If all went well, he could slip out after moonrise. Jean's chest felt tight with anticipation. It was one thing to plan, another to act. He still had no clear destination beyond south, but he figured once they were beyond the immediate watchful eyes of Castle Black, he could keep the dragon hidden under a tarp or furs. If they traveled mostly by night, he might avoid too many prying eyes. The biggest question: would the dragon endure the cold open air for the hours it took to reach shelter? He had enough furs and a brazier he could try rigging to the sled, though it was a fire hazard. Every moment felt precarious. The short day sped by, the sun never truly shining but offering a dim glow. As dusk approached, John took a final stock of what he'd gathered. If he failed to bring enough food, the dragon might starve on the journey. If the weather turned again, they might freeze. But staying at Castle Black was an even greater gamble. Word of the roaring beast had escalated among the brothers, and he'd overheard more than one vow to find the source. He would not wait to see what happened if they did. He forced down a meager dinner, ignoring the questioning glances of men who wondered why he took only a morsel of bread and cheese. Afterward, he lingered in the yard, pretending to supervise chores, until the sky deepened to inky black. The wind remained oddly calm, stirring the torches only slightly. Stars glimmered overhead, a sign that the clouds had finally parted. The wall itself rose like a massive white sentinel, luminous in the starlight. One by one, men headed indoors to find warmth in the barracks or the common hall. John waited, watching the silhouettes disappear. Soon, only a handful of watchmen remained at their posts, stamping their feet against the cold, their breath drifting in faint plumes. Ghost sat beside John in the shadows, quiet and alert. At last, close to midnight, John judged the moment had come. He slipped to his room, collected the sack of supplies, and slung it over his shoulder. Then he headed for the old storeroom door. The corridor below was silent, the gloom thick. With Ghost's help, he navigated by memory, only occasionally using a shuttered lantern to light the way. At the hidden cell door, he paused, heart pounding. Would the dragon sense what was to come? He pushed inside. The dragon lay coiled near the embers, eyes half-lidded. At Joan's arrival, it perked up, unfolding to its full height. Smoke curled from its nostrils in greeting. John shut the door behind him and set down the supply sack. "We're leaving tonight," he said quietly, voice echoing in the stillness. "I can't keep you here. It's dangerous for both of us." "Then?" The dragon watched, tail twitching. He rummaged through the sack, pulling out a thick fur cloak modified with straps. He had cut slits for the dragon's wings, though whether it would even tolerate such a thing was uncertain. He approached slowly, letting it sniff the heavy cloth. "It'll help keep you warm outside," he murmured. The dragon snorted, uncertain, but did not recoil. Gently, he slipped the improvised garment over the dragon's back. It was an awkward fit, the creature squirming at first, but he coaxed it with a few scraps of meat. At last, it settled, though it flicked its wings irritably within the makeshift slits. John stepped back, surveying the result. The cloak draped across the dragon's body, partially covering its flanks. The front was open, so it could still move freely, and the tail protruded at the back. It looked ridiculous, but it might provide a bit of insulation against the biting cold. He then gathered the rest of his supplies: small brazier, a pouch of coals, more furs, food rations, water skins, and secured them. The dragon paced, clearly sensing tension, sniffing the air. Ghost waited by the door, uneasy. When John finished, he knelt beside the creature, pressing a hand over its scaled cheek. "We must go quietly," he whispered. "You can't roar, can't hiss too loud. Understand?" Of course, it couldn't truly understand, but the soothing tone and repeated hush gesture had some effect. The dragon blinked and let out a soft, rumbling sigh. With trembling hands, John removed the wooden brace, then eased the door open. The corridor beyond lay in darkness. No sign of movement. Carefully, he led the dragon out, Ghost scouting ahead. Step by step, they threaded through the labyrinth of passages. At one juncture, the dragon's claws scraped loudly against a loose stone, echoing ominously. John froze, listening for any reaction from above. None came, but his heart hammered. Eventually, they reached the base of the small stair. Here was the greatest risk: emerging onto the ground floor storeroom room. If any man waited there, or even passed by, the secret would be laid bare. He gave Ghost a hand signal to move quietly. The direwolf climbed the steps, ears perked. After a tense moment, Ghost returned, silent but for the quiet pat of his paws, conveying no threat was near. John swallowed his fear. "Come," he whispered to the dragon. Ascending together proved nerve-wracking. The dragon was heavier now, and the steps were steep. Twice, it stumbled, flapping its wings in agitation. John muffled its hiss by stroking its neck, urging it onward. At the top, they emerged into the storeroom's gloom. Broken crates and half-rotted barrels stood in the corners, casting jagged shadows. Pale light from a single torch outside filtered through cracks in the doorframe. John pressed his ear to the door. Through the gap he glimpsed the courtyard, partially lit by a few flickering braziers. The guard on duty stood several yards away, leaning on a spear, his back turned. Beyond that, nothing stirred. Steeling himself, John carefully eased the door open. He signaled for Ghost to slip out first. Then gently, he coaxed the dragon forward. The creature was reluctant, clearly alarmed by the open air and flickering lights. But it followed, tail lashing behind. They stepped into the frigid night. The courtyard yawned before them, blanketed in fresh snow that glimmered under starlight. John's breath plumed. The guard remained turned away, apparently lost in thought, or simply lulled by the stillness. Heart pounding, John guided the dragon around the perimeter, sticking to the shadows by the fortress walls. Ghost led, ears swiveling. With each step, the dragon's claws crunched softly on the crusted snow, but the windless air threatened to magnify every sound. The side gate was just ahead, behind a row of stacked logs. The sled lay there, hidden in shadow. John forced himself to move slowly. The guard coughed once, turning slightly, and John froze, but the man's eyes never shifted far enough to see them. After a tense heartbeat, John resumed. At last they reached the sled. Quickly he unfastened the tether, guiding Hazel the mare from her discreet post behind the logs. The horse snorted, rolling her eyes at the unfamiliar scent of the dragon, but John patted her neck to calm her. Time was short. He piled his sack and the brazier onto the sled, then turned to the dragon. He placed a hand on its flank, gently urging it to climb aboard. The creature sniffed the wooden runners, uncertain. John used a morsel of meat to lure it forward. It let out a low hiss, but eventually complied, positioning itself on the sled. The structure creaked under its weight, but it held. John draped more furs around the dragon, hoping to hide its shape. Then he leaned down, quickly striking flint to spark the brazier. A small flame flickered to life, which he shielded from any distant watchers. The heat was minimal, but better than nothing. The dragon hissed softly at the sudden glow, but settled as soon as the warmth reached it. Ghost circled around, sniffing the night air for any sign of danger. John steeled himself, leading the mare to the side gate. The gate's wooden beams groaned. With shaking hands, he removed the iron bar that held it closed. If someone heard them now, but the night remained hushed. At last, the gate swung outward, revealing the frozen wilderness beyond. He glanced back at Castle Black. Memories of battles fought on those ramparts, of oaths sworn in the courtyard, flooded him. He had once believed this place his final home, that he might serve out his days here, bound by duty. Now, he was leaving, carrying a secret that might be seen as a betrayal of that very oath. But he had no choice. Something else pulled at him, a loyalty born of blood and fire. He exhaled a trembling breath and urged Hazel forward. The sled slid across the snow, the dragon's shape hunkered beneath furs, the brazier's glow concealed as best he could manage. Ghost padded alongside. They slipped through the gate, out into the darkness, leaving Castle Black behind. Snow crunched beneath horse and sled, the air cutting John's face like shards of glass. He kept a hand on the dragon's flank, feeling the creature shiver or perhaps tremble with excitement or fear. He could not tell which. After they traveled a short distance, he paused, stepping back to swing the gate shut again. He wedged a chunk of ice against it, in the hopes no one would immediately suspect an exit. Then, turning once more, he faced the open expanse ahead. The vastness of the north spread in every direction, cloaked in silver moonlight. Distant pines jutted like black spikes on the horizon. The hush felt enormous, as though the entire world were holding its breath. He tugged the mare's reins, and they continued south, away from the wall's looming shadow. For now, the wind held mercifully still. Though the cold was bitter, he prayed the brazier's modest heat, combined with the layered furs, would suffice to keep the dragon from freezing. Each puff of the beast's breath shimmered in the moonlight, tinted by faint wisps of smoke. John's own breath mingled with it, forming ghostly plumes that lingered in the still air. They pressed onward at a slow pace, the sled leaving twin tracks in the snow. Ghost trotted ahead, occasionally pausing to peer back at them. John walked beside the mare for now, unwilling to add his weight to the sled unless absolutely necessary. His mind reeled with uncertainty. Where exactly would they go? How far? He only knew they needed distance from Castle Black before dawn. A half-mile out, He glanced over his shoulder. The wall loomed like a gigantic pale barrier, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. No torches flickered along the top at this distance, and the black fortress at its base seemed like a silent silhouette. A pang of remorse twisted in John's chest. He had loved that place once. It had been the crucible where he found his purpose. But times had changed. So had he. Sucking in the icy air, he focused on the immediate task. Keep the dragon warm, keep Hazel calm, keep moving. The night was still young, and they had miles to cover. Each step forward was an act of faith that they might find a future somewhere beyond the horizon. The hush of the snowfield enveloped them, footsteps crunching in a steady rhythm. Now and then, the dragon shifted, letting out a subdued hiss, but otherwise remained as still as it could under the firs. John was grateful it hadn't panicked yet. He whispered occasional reassurances, glancing at the star-studded sky above. So long as the weather stayed calm, they had a chance. As they progressed, he cast occasional looks at the line of trees in the distance. If they could reach that cover, they might rest briefly, out of direct sight from anyone who chanced to scout near the wall. Yet, with every moment, the cold sank deeper. John fought the urge to shiver, flexing his fingers to keep blood flowing, wiggling his toes in his boots. The endless white plain reminded him of what lay beyond. Winter's domain, a harsh land that showed mercy to no one. But he had chosen to undertake this journey. There was no going back now. He set his jaw, pressing onward step by step, the sled's runners squealing softly against packed snow. Ghost ranged around them, a pale shape in the gloom, watchful. When John looked at the dragon, all coiled under those furs, he felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. He would not fail. There had been enough loss in his life. Too many good things had slipped away, consumed by war, betrayal, or duty. This time he was determined to see it through. The hush of the wild stretched before them, and somewhere in that silence lay the promise of a new dawn, for him, for the dragon, and perhaps for a world yet to be shaped by their choices.